Eleanor Whitmore did not faint at the altar. She chose not to. She stood in that white dress with her jaw locked and her hands cold and something wet and warm spreading beneath the silk at her ribs, and she smiled because that was what she had been trained to do. If you've ever stayed silent when you should have screamed, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel and follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Eleanor Whitmore was married, she did not pray. She had tried the night before, kneeling beside the narrow bed in the guest room of Whitmore Hall, the room they'd moved her to 6 months ago, so that her stepmother could use the larger suite, and she had pressed her hands together and waited for something to come. Some word, some warmth, some small sign that the God her father used to read about on Sunday mornings still had some passing interest in Eleanor's life. Nothing came. So she rose before the sun touched the curtains, and she sat at the edge of the bed in the dark, and she breathed, and she reminded herself of what she knew to be true. She was 24 years old. She was the daughter of Robert Whitmore, who had been a good man and a fair one, and who had died 3 years ago, in the autumn of 1814, leaving behind more debt than anyone had admitted, and more love than anyone had bothered to acknowledge. She was educated. She was calm. She was marrying Nathaniel Ashford today, and that was simply what was happening, the same way seasons changed, or rivers ran, not because she had asked for it, and not because she could stop it. She was good at accepting things she could not stop. Abigail arrived at 6:30, slipping through the door with the soft efficiency of someone who had learned to move through this house without being noticed. She was 22, and she had been Eleanor's personal maid since they were both children, back when Eleanor's mother was still alive, and the house still had warmth in it. Abigail set the water basin down, looked at Eleanor sitting upright in the dim light, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "You didn't sleep." "I slept a little." "Miss Eleanor?" "I slept enough, Abigail." Abigail didn't argue. She had learned over many years which silences to push against and which to leave alone. She poured the water and held the cloth, and they moved through the morning ritual with the quiet coordination of two people who had done this so many times that words were almost unnecessary. It was when she helped Eleanor into the corset that Abigail first noticed it. "This is tighter than the last fitting," Abigail said. Her hands had stilled at Eleanor's back fingers against the laces, and her voice had gone careful. "This is considerably tighter." Mrs. Whitmore had adjustments made. Silence. "When?" "Yesterday evening, after I had gone to bed." Eleanor kept her eyes on the mirror across the room. She watched her own face with the detached interest of a woman studying a stranger. "Clara Bennett came by. I didn't know about it until this morning." Abigail's hands moved again, slowly tracing the edge of the boning. "Eleanor," she said, and she hadn't used that name without the miss in front of it since Eleanor was 9 years old and had fallen out of the oak tree and split her knee open. "This is going to hurt." "I know. It's going to hurt a great deal." "I know that too." Abigail didn't say anything else. She tied the laces as loosely as she could manage without it being obvious, leaving the smallest fraction of give that she thought she could justify. And then she helped Eleanor into the dress itself. White silk with Flemish lace at the cuffs and collar. The kind of dress that cost more than most men in Richmond earned in a year. The kind of dress that was meant to announce to the room that the Whitmore family still had. Standing still had grace. Still had everything worth having. The dress had a hidden silver clasp at the left side seam just below the ribs. Eleanor had noticed it at the first fitting and asked Clara about it. Clara had smiled and said it was a structural piece necessary for the silhouette, and Eleanor had nodded and not asked again because she had learned by 24 that asking questions in this house usually resulted in worse answers than not asking. She understood what the clasp was for now. She understood it completely, as Abigail's hands, trembling very slightly, fastened it closed, and the dress pulled tight across Eleanor's ribs in a way that immediately changed the quality of the air in the room. "Tell me if—" "I'm all right," Eleanor said. She was not all right, but she was upright, and in her experience that was close enough. Margaret Whitmore arrived at 7 o'clock as Eleanor had known she would. She came in without knocking. She never knocked in this house, because in her mind, this house was still entirely hers, would always be entirely hers, regardless of what any court document or marriage certificate might eventually claim. And she stood in the doorway and looked at Eleanor with the particular expression she wore when something was meeting her standards for the first time. "Good," she said. Just that. Not beautiful, not lovely, not you look like your mother. God rest her. Good. As though Eleanor were a horse that had been properly groomed for auction. Margaret Whitmore was 51 years old, and she had married Robert Whitmore when Eleanor was 12, 4 years after Eleanor's own mother had died of fever. She was not an unkind woman in the way that simple women are unkind impulsively, visibly out of petty meanness. She was unkind the way that a winter frost is unkind methodically, thoroughly, without personal animus, simply doing what her nature demanded. She had grown up in a family where women's survival was measured in appearances. She believed this the way she believed in Scripture, not as a choice, but as a law of the physical world. You maintained the surface. You presented correctly. You felt whatever you felt in the privacy of your own chest, and you did not allow it to complicate the presentation. This was in her understanding not cruelty, but wisdom. It was the inheritance she was passing on to Eleanor whether Eleanor wanted it or not. "The clasp," Margaret said, moving toward Eleanor, and Abigail stepped aside with her eyes lowered. "It's fastened," Eleanor said. "I can see that." Margaret's hands were at Eleanor's side now at the seam, and her fingers pressed the clasp with 2 deliberate clicks that tightened it 1 degree further. Eleanor's breath went short, and she kept her face exactly as it was. "Clara did good work. I wasn't sure she understood what I was asking for." "What were you asking for?" Margaret stepped back and looked at her again. "Perfection," she said as though it were self-evident. "Nathaniel Ashford has his pick of women in this state, Eleanor. He chose you because of this family's name, and because you have your father's temperament, quiet, reasonable, manageable. You will not give him any cause to question that choice today." "I wasn't planning to." "You never plan anything." Margaret adjusted Eleanor's veil with quick, certain fingers. "That's precisely the problem. You have your father's gentleness without his decisiveness, and in a woman that reads as weakness. Today you will hold yourself correctly, and you will smile, and you will not let anyone in that church see a single thing that might suggest this family is anything other than what it presents itself as." Eleanor looked at her stepmother's reflection in the mirror. She thought not for the first time about the letters. Her father's letters, the ones he had written in the last months of his life, the ones that Margaret had taken from his desk before the burial and had never returned, and had claimed when Eleanor asked did not exist. She thought about the property documents, the Whitmore land holdings, the accounts that were technically in her name, but that she had never been permitted to access. She thought about all of it, held it very still in the center of her chest, and then she put it away the way she always put it away, filed it behind the quiet and the stillness and the practiced calm. Later, she told herself, the way she always told herself, later. "Yes, ma'am," she said. Margaret nodded and left the room. Abigail waited until the sound of her footsteps had faded down the hall, and then she turned to Eleanor, and her face was doing something complicated that she was trying to keep professional. "Miss Eleanor," she said quietly. "We still have time. You could what?" Abigail pressed her lips together. "I don't know. Something. Abigail." Eleanor turned from the mirror for the first time since she'd gotten out of bed. She looked at her directly. "What would you do truly? Tell me what you think I should do." Abigail's eyes were bright. She was a practical girl, not given to sentiment, and the brightness in her eyes was something she was working hard to control. "I think," she said slowly, "that your father would not have wanted this. My father arranged this before he died. He arranged for you to have options, not for you to be—" She stopped. "Managed," Eleanor said. Abigail nodded. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside the window she could hear the sounds of the town beginning to move, horses and carriage wheels, and voices. People gathering early because Ashford weddings were events in Richmond, were things people dressed for, and arrived early to and talked about for weeks afterward. "My father's letters," Eleanor said. "You know she has them." "I know. If she keeps them, I have no proof of what he intended for the property. No legal footing, nothing to stand on." "I know that too." "So." Eleanor turned back to the mirror and took one careful, measured breath against the pull of the dress. "I go. And I am good, and I am quiet, and I marry Nathaniel Ashford, and I find another way. That's what I do. That's what I've always done." Abigail didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say to that. She simply picked up the veil and began to arrange it, her hands very gentle, and the mourning continued the way mornings do, relentlessly, regardless of what anyone in them wanted. The Church of St. John's in Richmond had been standing since before the Revolution. Eleanor had been baptized. There had sat in those pews every Sunday of her childhood, had watched her father's coffin carried down the center aisle on a gray October morning 3 years ago. She knew every carved detail of the woodwork, every angle of light that came through those east-facing windows in the summer morning. She had never in her life walked into it the way she walked in today. There were perhaps 200 people in the pews, the finest families of Richmond and the surrounding counties, men in their best coats, and women in silk and muslin. Everyone arranged in the tiers of local society, the way people arrange themselves without being asked, the highest families at the front and the lesser ones fading back toward the entrance. They all turned when the doors opened. They all looked at her. She heard the collective intake of breath that a beautiful woman in a beautiful dress produces in a room, and she felt absolutely nothing about it except a vague awareness that she was still standing and that her breathing, while not what she would call comfortable, was at least continuing. She did not look at the faces in the pews. She looked at the end of the aisle. Nathaniel Ashford was standing at the altar. She had met him 4 times before today. Once at a dinner at the Haverford House in the spring, where he had been brought as a possible match, and where Margaret had maneuvered them into a conversation about agricultural management that had lasted 20 minutes, and from which Eleanor had emerged with the distinct impression that he was a serious man who was not especially interested in being charmed. Once at a garden party where he had arrived late and left early and said perhaps 11 words to her directly. Once at a tea that Margaret had engineered at Whitmore Hall specifically for the purpose of allowing him to observe Eleanor in a domestic setting. And he had been courteous and had eaten the cake and had watched her with gray eyes that gave nothing away. And once 2 weeks ago, when he had come to formally request her hand, sitting across the parlor from her while Margaret hovered, and the family solicitor shuffled papers, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded and heard herself be discussed in the third person for 37 minutes. She had not disliked him precisely. She had not liked him either. He was 35 and he was tall and he moved with the particular economy of a man who had no need to perform anything for anyone, and he had an angular face that wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but that you kept returning to, kept wanting to understand. He was the Iron Gentleman, they called him in Richmond. Nathaniel Ashford, who had run his father's estate since he was 19, who had expanded the Ashford holdings to cover more Virginia land than any other private family, who had a reputation for absolute fairness in his dealings and a corresponding reputation for absolutely no warmth whatsoever. He had chosen her. She still wasn't entirely certain why. She walked down the aisle, one careful step at a time, and she breathed, and she held her father's memory in her chest like something small and warm, and she kept her eyes on Nathaniel Ashford's face. And somewhere around the midpoint of the aisle, somewhere between the Haverford family's pew and the Carrington family's, she felt the wetness. Just a small thing. A warmth at her left side just below the ribs, exactly where the silver clasp sat. A slow spreading warmth that she understood immediately and completely. She did not stop walking. She did not change her face. She kept her eyes on the altar, and she kept breathing, and she kept walking one foot in front of the other, and she thought, hold on, just hold on. She reached the altar. She turned to face the minister. She was aware that Nathaniel Ashford had turned to look at her at the moment she reached him, and that he was looking at her with something that wasn't quite the studied, polite attention of their previous meetings. Something that was more alert, more careful. She did not look directly at him. She looked at Reverend Matthew's collar, at the silver pin that held it, and she breathed, and she listened to his voice begin the words she had heard performed at a dozen other weddings over her lifetime. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here. Around her 200 people rustling silk-stifled coughs, the particular collective hush of an audience waiting for something to be completed. Beside her, Nathaniel Ashford, very still watching her in her periphery with those gray eyes she couldn't read. At her side, beneath the white silk warmth and wet, and the slow patient evidence of a truth that a roomful of people were about to pretend not to see. Do you take this man? Eleanor opened her mouth. I do, she said clearly. She meant it in the way that a woman means the only decision left available to her. She nearly fell twice during the wedding breakfast. The first time was in the receiving line when Mrs. Carrington leaned in to kiss her cheek and offered some pleasantry about what a fine match this was and how Robert Whitmore would have been so proud. And Eleanor felt the edges of her vision go gray for a moment, a slow, silvery wash that came and went before she could decide what to do about it. The second time was when Margaret appeared at her side to guide her toward the long table, a hand at her elbow, grip firm in the way that always looked gentle to other people and never was. And Eleanor's left leg nearly went out from under her on the turn. A deep unsteadiness that she recovered from smoothly enough that she hoped no one noticed. Nathaniel Ashford noticed. She didn't see it happening in the moment. She was concentrating too hard on the very specific mechanics of remaining vertical. But she became aware gradually over the first 20 minutes of the breakfast that he was watching her in a way that was different from the polite social attention that a husband was expected to pay his new wife in public. It was more focused than that. It was the kind of attention a man pays when something isn't adding up. She was seated at his right hand. He sat at the head of the long table, with the easy authority of a man entirely at home in his own consequence, and he spoke to the guests nearest him, and accepted their congratulations, and was everything that was required of him. And through all of it, those gray eyes kept returning to her, and she felt each return the way you feel a needlepoint, small and precise and impossible to ignore. Around her the breakfast was doing what wedding breakfasts did. Conversation and laughter and the clink of glasses, the particular celebratory noise of a gathering that was about itself as much as it was about the occasion. Margaret held court at the far end of the table, radiant, and controlled the undisputed social orchestrator of the afternoon. Several of the older women from Richmond's better families were clustered near her, the inner circle, and Eleanor watched them laugh at something Margaret said and felt the old familiar distance open up between herself and the rest of the human race. You're not eating, Nathaniel said. His voice was low, not for the table angled toward her private. She turned and found him looking at her directly for the first time since the altar. I'm not very hungry. You haven't been very hungry for about 40 minutes. She kept her expression mild. Wedding nerves, Mr. Ashford. I imagine that's not uncommon. He didn't respond immediately. He picked up his glass and turned it once in his fingers in a way that suggested he was turning something else over at the same time. Then he said, You walked down the aisle as though you were in some pain. The table noise continued around them. No one nearby was attending to their conversation. Still, Eleanor felt the ground shift under her slightly. The dress is formal, she said. The construction is, You hesitated twice, he said. Once at approximately the middle of the aisle, and once at the step up to the chancel. Both times the pause was small enough that no one else would have noticed. I noticed. She looked at him. He looked back at her. His face was exactly as unrevealing as it had always been in her presence. But she was beginning to think that what she'd taken for blankness was actually something else entirely, not the absence of thought, but the presence of a great deal of it, held very close. I'm perfectly well, she said. I see, he said. And from the quality of his silence after that, she understood that he did not see, and that he was not prepared to pretend that he did, but that he was also, for reasons she couldn't yet parse, not going to press further. Not here. Not in front of 200 people. Not with Margaret Whitmore holding court 20 feet away. He looked away from her. He answered some remark that the man on his left had made. He was, from all observable evidence, a man enjoying his wedding breakfast. Under the table, Eleanor curled her fingers around the edge of her chair seat and held on and breathed and held on. It was Abigail who made it visible. Abigail had been stationed near the wall with the other household staff, the part of the room that formal guests didn't look at the moving background of a wealthy gathering. Eleanor had known she was there, the way you know the position of something you need not watching it, but always aware of it. She saw the moment Abigail saw it. Abigail's face, which was trained to absolute professional stillness in these settings, went briefly through something it wasn't supposed to go through. Her eyes dropped to Eleanor's side to the chair where Eleanor was seated, and then something very controlled happened in her expression, and she looked away, and she began moving with careful casualness toward the far side of the room. Eleanor didn't look down. She knew what was there. She kept her face exactly as it was, and she continued her conversation with the wife of a local magistrate about the unseasonably warm summer, and she thought how long. How much longer do I have before someone else, Mrs. Ashford? It was the first time anyone had called her that, Nathaniel's voice low from very close. He had leaned slightly toward her, without turning his head, still presenting the profile of a man engaged with the broader table. His voice barely reached her ear. "Don't stand up," he said. She went very still. "Whatever is happening," he said. "Don't stand up from that chair until I indicate." "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Automatic, training. I think you do." A pause. She felt him shift almost imperceptibly in his chair. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer. Can you do that?" She almost laughed. An honest answer. She had not given a fully honest answer about her own physical state to another human being in 3 years. "I can try," she said. "Are you injured?" The word landed differently than she expected. Not embarrassed, not politely euphemistic, the way the word would have come from any other man at this table. Just direct. "Are you injured?" She looked at her plate. She counted 2 heartbeats. "I believe so," she said. "Yes." The quality of the silence beside her changed. "The dress," he said. Not a question. She didn't answer that. She picked up her water glass and drank from it and kept her face perfectly civil. She heard him exhale. A short controlled breath, the kind that contains something larger than it lets out. Then he was straightening beside her, and his voice was rising back to its normal register, and he was saying something to the table, a pleasantry, a comment about the heat, something that drew the attention of the nearest guest toward him, and in the reorganizing shuffle of social attention that followed, he rose from his chair and came around to her side of the table, and he said, easy and unhurried, "My wife and I are going to take some air. The room has grown warm." Margaret's head came up at the far end of the table. "Of course," said the magistrate's wife warmly. "Perfectly natural." "A moment," Margaret said, starting to rise. Nathaniel looked at her. It was not an aggressive look. It was not a challenging look in the way that physical challenges are issued. It was simply a look gray and quiet, and containing some quality that Eleanor couldn't name, but that apparently Margaret recognized because she sat back down. Nathaniel extended his hand to Eleanor. She took it. She stood carefully, keeping her left side angled away from the table, and she let him guide her. Not gripping, not pulling, just there, his hand at a formal distance, and yet providing exactly enough to keep her steadied through the tables and toward the doors. She heard the room close behind them. She heard conversation resume. She heard Margaret's voice pick up some thread that suggested everything was entirely as expected. She said nothing until they were in the hall. The hall was cool and dim and empty. Nathaniel closed the doors to the reception room and then turned and looked at her, really looked in the way he apparently looked at things when no one else was watching, and he said without preamble, "I need you to tell me what is happening." "I'm fine," she said. It came out quieter than she intended. "Mrs. Ashford, Eleanor," she said, and then immediately wasn't certain why she'd said that. Something shifted in his face, almost imperceptibly. "Eleanor," he said, "I have been watching you for 3 hours, and you have not been fine for a single moment of that time. You walked down the aisle bleeding, and you stood at that altar and said your vows, and you sat through 40 minutes of a wedding breakfast, and you have not indicated by a single word or gesture that anything is wrong." He paused. "That is either extraordinary courage or extraordinary conditioned silence, and I am not yet certain which, but either way, I am asking you to stop performing it for approximately the next 5 minutes." She stared at him. It was without question the most words he had ever said to her directly. It was also possibly the most accurate description anyone had ever offered of how she moved through the world. "I need a physician," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know. Abigail is already getting one." She blinked. "How did you—" "I spoke to her when I came around the table." He watched her face. "She's been terrified for you since this morning. You know that." Eleanor said nothing. She was aware suddenly of how much of her energy over the last several hours had been devoted to not knowing things she already knew. "The clasp," he said, "on the dress." "It's a structural piece," she said, because it was the only thing she had to say about it that was in any way neutral. He looked at her for a long moment. "Who modified the dress?" "I wasn't present when it was modified." "When did you discover it had been modified?" "This morning." The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it that presses down on what's being said. "Eleanor." His voice had changed again, something in it that wasn't quite softness, but was adjacent to it, something she didn't have a name for yet. "I understand that you don't know me. I understand that this is our wedding day, and we have spoken perhaps 200 words to each other in total prior to this hour, and that you have no particular reason to trust that I am asking these questions in good faith." A beat. "But I am asking them in good faith. I want you to know that." She looked at him. Really looked the way she hadn't allowed herself to do in the church or at the breakfast. The gray eyes, the set of his jaw, the fact that he had left his own wedding reception and was standing in a dim hallway asking her questions that no one else in that room had thought to ask. "My stepmother," she said carefully, "arranged for alterations to be made to this dress after my final fitting, without my knowledge. The clasp at my left side was tightened beyond what the original design called for." She stopped. "I believe the resulting injury is minor. I'm not certain." He absorbed this. "And you married me anyway," he said. "I was going to marry you regardless." "That's not what I—" He stopped. Something in his expression that she couldn't read there and gone. "I mean that you stood at that altar in pain and said your vows, with a smile." "Yes." Because, she said steadily, "I have spent 12 years learning that what I feel and what I show are two separate things, and because I had 200 witnesses watching me, and because stopping the ceremony was not an option that was available to me in any practical sense." He was very quiet for a moment. "What would have happened," he said slowly, "if you'd stopped the ceremony?" "I would have gone home," she said, "to Whitmore Hall, where my stepmother has legal guardianship over the property my father left me, and my father's correspondence, and every document that could establish what I am actually owed, and where she would have remained in that position indefinitely." He let that sit. She watched him process it the way you watch someone read a ledger carefully, without rushing, understanding that each line connects to the ones before and after it. "The letters," he said. She hadn't mentioned the letters. "Your father wrote letters before he died." She felt something go very still inside her. "How do you know that?" "Because your father told me he had." Nathaniel's voice was measured even. "We were acquainted, not well but enough. He mentioned in the last year of his life that he was putting his affairs in order and that he had written clearly about his intentions for the Whitmore estate." He paused. "He said Eleanor would have access to everything she needed." The hallway was very quiet. "She told me the letters didn't exist," Eleanor said. Her voice came out entirely level, which was remarkable given what was happening in her chest. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "I suspected she might." Eleanor looked at him. "Is that why you—" She stopped. "Is that why I agreed to this marriage?" She waited. He looked at her with those clear gray eyes that she was beginning to understand weren't empty at all, just careful. "I agreed to this marriage," he said, "because your father asked me to. 3 months before he died, he came to me and he said—" He paused, seemed to select his words. He said that he had a daughter who was going to need someone in her corner, and that the man who married her should understand that he was not acquiring property. He was taking on a responsibility. Eleanor's throat was doing something she would not permit to proceed further. "He described you," Nathaniel continued. "He said you were smarter than you were ever allowed to show, and that you'd been conditioned to be quiet about it, and that whoever ended up with you would either see that or miss it entirely and would be diminished for the missing." A very slight pause. "I found that compelling." "You married me," Eleanor said, and she was very proud of how steady her voice was, "because my father asked you to." "I agreed to consider it because your father asked me to. I'm standing in this hallway because of what I've observed in the last 3 hours." He looked at her steadily. "Those are different things." The door at the end of the hall opened, and Abigail came through it with Dr. Hartley, who was the Ashford family physician, and who looked with professional discretion at Eleanor, at Nathaniel, and at the hallway in general, and said that perhaps they might want to find a quieter room. The room they found was a small parlor off the main entrance. Dr. Hartley asked the questions physicians ask, and Eleanor answered them, and Nathaniel stood by the window, with his back to the room, in a way that made clear he was there, and was not leaving, and was also extending what privacy was possible in the circumstances. The clasp was unfastened by Abigail, who did it with her jaw set, and her hands entirely steady, and her eyes bright in a way she was not going to allow to become tears. The dress released, breathed. Eleanor breathed. She became for the first time in 8 hours a person whose air supply was not being rationed. The injury was as she had hoped minor. A laceration small but deep, the kind that bleeds significantly for its size. Dr. Hartley dressed it with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to ask only the necessary questions, and he said she should rest, and she said she would, and everyone in the room understood that this was approximately the most she was going to be permitted to promise. When the doctor had finished and left, Abigail stayed, and Nathaniel turned from the window, and the three of them were alone in the small parlor, with the sounds of the wedding breakfast continuing distantly through the walls. "I want to see the dress," Nathaniel said. Abigail looked at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded. Abigail brought the dress forward. Eleanor was in a day dress that had been retrieved. Abigail's own practical thinking, she always had a change available, and Nathaniel took it and examined the left seam with the focused attention he had apparently given to everything in Eleanor's vicinity today. He found the clasp. He ran his thumb along the track that had let it be tightened beyond the original setting. He looked at the threads. New threads, different color than the original work, subtle but visible if you were looking. "This was done deliberately," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "After the final fitting." "Yes." "To cause precisely this result." She said nothing. He didn't need an answer. "Who modified this?" He looked up. "She hired Clara Bennett, but Mrs. Whitmore gave the instructions." "Clara Bennett, who did the original work?" "Yes." He turned the dress over in his hands once more. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a burst of laughter from the reception room muffled through the wall. Someone was making a toast. "Eleanor," he said, and he set the dress down. "I need to know everything. Not just this everything. The property documents, the letters, what she's told you, what she's done in the 3 years since your father died. I need to know all of it." He met her eyes. "Will you tell me?" She sat for a moment with the question. She had spent so long with the weight of what she knew and couldn't use, with the information that she carried alone, and that was heavy precisely because it was alone. And here was a man she had known for 3 hours asking her to put it down. A man her father had chosen. A man who had stood in a hallway and told her that knowing and missing are different things. "Yes," she said. "I'll tell you everything." And for the first time that morning, she meant something the way she had always wanted to mean it, not because there was no other choice, but because she had made one. She told him a great deal in that small parlor with the wedding reception proceeding without them through the wall. She told him about the letters, her father's correspondence in the final year of his life, the way he had become deliberate about certain things, the way he had begun saying, "I want you to know, and the time will come when," and making small gestures that she understood now were preparations. She told him about the reading of the will, the way Margaret had arrived the next morning with the family solicitor and managed the proceedings with such smooth authority that Eleanor had not understood until 3 days later exactly what had been arranged, and by then Margaret had possession of the paper documents, and the solicitor was a man who owed Margaret more professional courtesies than he owed Eleanor any duty. She told him about the house, the gradual reorganization that had begun within a month of her father's death, the way the rooms that had been Eleanor's began to become Margaret's, the way the household staff changed so incrementally that you couldn't point to any one moment and say, "There, that's when it happened." But only look up one day and find yourself in a house full of people who answered to someone else. She told him about the asset management, the Whitmore land, the rental income from 3 properties in the county, the business interests her father had built over 30 years. All of it technically in her name, and all of it entirely controlled by Margaret, with the legal scaffolding of the guardianship arrangement, which Eleanor's solicitor had said was unassailable without direct evidence of mismanagement, and which Margaret had been very careful to avoid providing. She told him about the men who had come to call in the 2 years after her father's death, the ones that Margaret had arranged to meet her, one after another. All of them selected Eleanor had eventually understood for the same set of qualities property that could be combined with the Whitmore Holdings social standing that would benefit Margaret's position and temperaments that were unlikely to ask too many questions about financial arrangements. She told him because he was listening with the quality of attention that makes telling possible that she had been afraid. Not specifically of today, but of the larger thing of spending the next 30 years in a life that was technically hers and practically someone else's, of being the kind of woman who was described as fortunate by everyone who saw her and who knew that the word meant managed. Nathaniel listened through all of it without interrupting. He sat across from her in a parlor chair that was slightly too small for him, his hands folded, and he listened with his whole face in the way that some people have, not performing attention, but actually in it, tracking each thing she said against everything he'd already understood. When she finished, the room was quiet. "The letters are at Whitmore Hall," he said. "I believe so. In her sitting room. And the property documents. The solicitor's office, I think. But she has access." He nodded slowly. He was looking at the window through it at something she couldn't see. "Samuel Reed is my family's attorney," he said. "He's here today at the breakfast." He turned back to her. "He's good, and he doesn't owe Margaret Whitmore anything. A challenge to the guardianship arrangement. A challenge to a great many things," Nathaniel said quietly. "But yes, starting there." He paused. "This won't be quick. I want you to understand that. These things, untangling this kind of arrangement, it takes time, and it requires patience, and there are going to be moments when it gets worse before it gets better." "I'm familiar with patience," Eleanor said. "I imagine you are." Something in his expression. Not quite warmth. She didn't think warmth was a word in his particular emotional vocabulary, but something genuine. Something that saw her. "Eleanor, I want you to hear me say this clearly." He met her eyes. "What happened today was not acceptable. What has happened over the last 3 years is not acceptable, and it is not going to continue." She held his gaze. She was waiting for the other part of that sentence, the part that said, "Because now I am responsible for you," or "because you are my wife," or some version of the ownership that she had been prepared all her life to receive in one form or another. It didn't come. "Because," he said simply, "a person's dignity should not depend on who is in the room with them." She breathed. Outside the window, a bird called twice, stopped, called again. The summer pressed against the glass, green and abundant and indifferent to everything that had happened inside this house today. "All right," she said. "All right." "I hear you," she said. "And I believe you mean it." She stopped. I'm not accustomed to believing that. I want you to know that I'm trying. He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought again that she didn't know this man, not yet, not even slightly, but that she might have been wrong about what kind of man he was, and that being wrong in that direction was a new experience, and she wasn't sure yet what to do with it. That's enough for today, he said. That's plenty for today. Abigail appeared in the doorway, her face composed. They're starting to ask questions in there, she said. Mrs. Whitmore is. Tell them Mrs. Ashford needed a moment of rest, Nathaniel said, rising. Tell them she's perfectly well, and will rejoin the party shortly. He looked at Eleanor. Unless you'd prefer not to go back in. I'll go back in, Eleanor said. She stood with the careful deliberateness that had governed her movements all day, and she settled her dress around her, and she held herself the way she had always held herself in public, straight collected, nothing showing that wasn't meant to show, except that something was different. She could breathe. She could actually fully breathe. And she was not certain whether it was purely the unfastened clasp, or whether some other thing had also in the last hour been given a small amount of room. Nathaniel, she said, because she had apparently decided that was how it was going to be. He looked at her. Thank you. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Don't thank me yet, he said. We've only just started. They walked back into the wedding breakfast side by side, and Margaret Whitmore was watching from her end of the table as they crossed the room, and she was smiling smooth and satisfied and entirely at ease, and she raised her glass in their direction when they took their seats. Eleanor smiled back. Nathaniel lifted his own glass just slightly in the direction of the attorney Samuel Reed across the table, who looked up and met his eye and gave a single brief nod in the way of men who communicate in the compressed vocabulary of long professional relationships. The breakfast continued. The guests continued. The summer afternoon pressed golden through the windows, and the music from the small ensemble in the corner played something that no one was listening to. Margaret smiled. Eleanor smiled. Nathaniel sat between them, with his hands folded, and his gray eyes moving over the room with the quiet, meticulous attention of a man who had just begun to take inventory. He was not, Eleanor was realizing, a man who left things incomplete. And somewhere under the table still held in Eleanor's hand the silver clasp. Small, exact, cool in her palm. She had taken it quietly from the dress. She was not entirely certain why. She only knew that she was not ready to put it down. The wedding breakfast ended at 4:30, and by 5 o'clock, the guests had begun to thin carriages, pulling away from the front of the Haverford house in the long golden light of a Virginia summer evening. Eleanor watched them go from the doorway of the small parlor, and she was aware with the particular precision of a woman who had spent years cataloging threats that Margaret had not yet left. Margaret was saying her goodbyes at the entrance with the unhurried grace of a woman who owned the room she was standing in, and she kissed cheeks and pressed hands and laughed at remarks, and she was magnificent at it, genuinely, technically magnificent, the kind of social performance that takes decades to perfect. Eleanor watched her and thought not for the first time that if Margaret had been born into different circumstances, she would have been formidable in a way that people actually admired. Nathaniel appeared at Eleanor's shoulder. Reed got what he needed, he said quietly in the register he seemed to reserve for things he didn't want to carry past the two of them. What did he need? Names, dates, enough to begin pulling the thread. He paused. He's going to want to speak with you directly, probably tomorrow. Tomorrow, Eleanor repeated. The word felt strange. Tomorrow she would wake up in Ashford Estate. Tomorrow was a different country entirely. If you're not ready. I'm ready, she said. I've been ready for 3 years. I was just waiting for a door. He said nothing to that. She felt him look at her in the way he had developed. She was already beginning to recognize it, the specific quality of it, the sense of being measured not against some external standard, but against what she had said previously, whether it matched, whether it held. She thought he was a man who tracked inconsistencies the way accountants track figures. Not suspiciously, just accurately. Then Margaret was walking toward them, and Eleanor felt her own posture adjust, automatic and long-trained, the particular arrangement of her face and shoulders that she'd been performing in Margaret's presence for 12 years. "Leaving so soon," Margaret said, and she directed this at Nathaniel, not Eleanor, which was its own kind of statement. "We are," Nathaniel said. "Eleanor hasn't said goodbye to the Carrington family." "She has, actually," Eleanor said pleasantly. "I spoke with Mrs. Carrington directly. She sends her warmest regards." A flicker in Margaret's eyes. Not anger, something more complicated. She looked between them once, a quick assessment, and Eleanor knew the precise moment that Margaret understood something had changed, because the smile on her face went from genuine social performance to something slightly more careful. "Well," Margaret said, "then I'll call on you Thursday. There are still a number of household items at Whitmore Hall that belong to Eleanor, her mother's things. I thought you might want them settled before—" "Send a list to Samuel Reed," Nathaniel said. The smile held, just barely. "I beg your pardon?" "A written list of any items you believe should be transferred. Send it to Reed's office. He'll coordinate the logistics." Margaret's eyes went to Eleanor, and in them was a question. "When did you tell him? And what did you say, and how much does he actually know?" And Eleanor met her gaze with an expression of polite blankness that she had learned ironically from Margaret herself. "Of course," Margaret said. Her voice was entirely even. "Whatever is most convenient." She kissed Eleanor's cheek, dry and exact. She nodded to Nathaniel. And she left, passing through the entrance with the same perfect composure she'd carried all day, and the door closed behind her, and Eleanor breathed out through her nose very slowly. "She knows something shifted," Eleanor said. "Yes. She'll start moving things, documents, accounts, whatever she can adjust before Reed starts looking." Reed anticipated that. Nathaniel turned from the door. He sent a letter this afternoon before the breakfast was over to the county records office and to the Whitmore family solicitor. Formal notice of representation. She can't move anything without it becoming part of the record. Eleanor turned to look at him. "You planned that before we even spoke this afternoon." "I planned for the possibility." He met her eyes. "Your father told me enough that I thought it prudent." She held that thought for a moment. The idea that someone had been quietly, methodically prepared to catch her, not because they knew everything, but because they'd thought ahead enough to leave a net. It was such an unfamiliar thing that she didn't quite know where to put it. "You should have told me," she said, "before today." "You're right," he said without hesitation or qualification. "I should have." She blinked. "I made an error in judgment," he continued. "I thought that what I'd arranged would be sufficient without involving you directly, and in doing so, I left you without information you were entitled to have. I'm sorry for that." Eleanor had been apologized to before. Margaret apologized with grace and frequency, and it meant nothing at all. It was a social tool, no different from a curtsy or a calling card. This was something different. This had the texture of a man who had made a genuine accounting, and arrived at a genuine conclusion, and was saying so without ornamentation. "All right," she said. "All right. I accept it." She paused. "Don't do it again." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, she wasn't sure yet that he had smiles in the conventional sense, but something adjacent. "I won't," he said. Abigail rode with them in the carriage to Ashford Estate, which was 17 miles outside Richmond, and Eleanor was grateful for this in the way that she was grateful for practical things. Not emotionally, just recognizably, the way you acknowledge that water when you're thirsty is a good and necessary thing. She sat across from Nathaniel in the moving carriage, and the road was dry, and the summer evening was turning the light amber through the windows, and she thought about tomorrow, about Reed, about what she would have to say, and in what order, and what the shape of it would look like laid out flat in the language of legal proceedings. "Tell me about the estate," she said. Nathaniel looked up from whatever he'd been thinking about. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. What it's like. What the household runs to. How many people work the land." She watched him. "I've lived in this county my whole life, and I've never been further from Richmond than the Haverford Road." "The main house has 14 rooms," he said. 8 in regular use. The farm runs about 400 acres actively, another 200 in timber and grazing. There are 11 families living on tenant portions, and I employ about 30 people directly in the house and grounds. How long have you managed it yourself? Since I was 19. My father was not well for the last years of his life. My mother died when I was 12. She noticed that he offered this without any of the social softening that people usually applied to such information. No, it was a long time ago, or I was fortunate to have good guidance. Just the facts of it stated with the same flat accuracy he used for everything else. And you've never, she stopped, never married. He said it without any particular charge. No, there were arrangements discussed when I was younger. Nothing that came to anything. A pause. I think, more difficult to arrange than most. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because I kept asking inconvenient questions about what the woman in question actually wanted. It made families uncomfortable. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. That sounds, she said carefully, like a feature rather than a flaw. Most of the families involved did not see it that way. No, she said. I don't imagine they did. The carriage was quiet for a stretch. Abigail had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window with the careful discretion of someone making themselves deliberately small. Eleanor was used to this. Abigail had spent 22 years occupying rooms without being in them, and she felt a sudden specific surge of affection for her that she immediately put aside to feel later. There's something you should know, Eleanor said, before we arrive. Tell me. I'm not... She pressed her lips together. I'm not accustomed to being seen, to having people track what I'm doing or ask what I want or notice when something is wrong. I've been managing my own internal situation largely in private for a very long time, and I'm good at it, and sometimes when people notice things She stopped again. I have a tendency to say I'm fine before I've checked whether that's true. He considered this. Should I call attention to that when it happens? I think, she said slowly, that you should? Yes. I can do that. You'll probably find it happens more often than seems reasonable. I don't have a fixed sense of what's reasonable in that regard, he said. So that shouldn't present a problem. Eleanor looked at him and thought, My father knew you. My father sat across from you and talked about me, and trusted that you were the kind of man worth trusting. And she felt again that thing from the parlor, that difficult, uncertain warmth, that unfamiliar sensation of weight being redistributed. Outside the road ran on through the summer evening, and Richmond fell away behind them, and Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor Ashford now apparently turned her face toward a house she had never seen, and decided that she was not going to be afraid of it. She was going to be strategic instead. That was something she knew how to do. Samuel Reed arrived at Ashford Estate the following morning at 9 o'clock precisely, and Eleanor came down to meet him in the study that Nathaniel had indicated was available for any use she wanted to put it to, which was the kind of statement she was still processing. Any use you want, because she had not had a room available for any use she wanted in 3 years. Reed was 60 and small, and had the organized energy of a man who had spent 40 years in close proximity to other people's complicated affairs and had developed from this an efficient compassion. He looked at Eleanor when she came into the room, and he said, Mrs. Ashford, I'm sorry for what's brought us here, but I'm glad we're here. Thank you, she said. Let's be efficient. He looked at her over his glasses, and something in his expression registered approval. Exactly, he said. Let's. She told him everything she had told Nathaniel and more, because in the night she had gone through it all the way. You go through a room you thought you'd organized, looking for anything you missed, and she had found things. Specific dates, specific amounts. The name of the tenant farmer who had paid his quarterly rent directly to Margaret for the last 2 years, because that's what he'd been told to do, and who had asked Eleanor about it once at the market and been confused by her confusion. The detail of the household accounts that she'd glimpsed once when Margaret had left them out, which showed expenditures from the Whitmore Property Fund for Margaret's personal use travel clothing. social engagements, running to a figure that was not as far as Eleanor could determine, consistent with any legitimate management expense. Reed wrote carefully. He asked precise questions, and she answered them, and Nathaniel sat at the edge of the room with a cup of coffee, and said almost nothing, which Eleanor appreciated because it meant she was talking to Reed and not being talked about. After 2 hours, Reed set his pen down. The guardianship structure is the core problem, he said. It was drawn up by Thomas Graves, who is technically competent, but who was very clearly acting on Margaret's instruction rather than your father's. The language allows for broad discretionary management of the estate assets. He paused. Broad enough that challenging specific expenditures is going to be slow. But, Eleanor said, because there was clearly a but. But the letters are a different matter. He leaned forward slightly. If your father wrote clearly about his intentions, and from what Nathaniel has told me about the conversations he had with Robert, I believe he did, then those letters constitute evidence of intent that directly contradicts the arrangement Margaret arranged to have documented. A court that sees both documents will have questions about how one superseded the other. She'll say the letters don't exist, Eleanor said. Yes. She's said so directly, to me multiple times. Which, Reed said, is a problem for her, not for us if we can locate them first. He looked at her steadily. You said you believe they're at Whitmore Hall, in her sitting room. I believe so. You've been in that sitting room. Many times. I know the room well. Reed looked across the room at Nathaniel, and something passed between them in the compressed vocabulary of men who have worked together for a long time. Then, Reed said, I will be filing a formal petition with the county court today. As part of that petition, I will be requesting a preservation order, which means that Margaret Whitmore cannot legally remove, destroy, or transfer any documents related to the Whitmore estate until the court has reviewed the matter. He paused. It will take 3 to 5 days to be granted. During those days, she'll know it's coming, and she'll make choices about those letters. Eleanor understood exactly what he was saying and what he was not saying. I see. I want to be clear that I am not suggesting anything, Reed said carefully. I am simply noting that the timing is relevant. It's very relevant, Eleanor said. After Reed left, Eleanor sat for a moment in the study, with her hands flat on the table, and she ran through the architecture of what she knew. Whitmore Hall. Margaret's sitting room, second door on the left past the main staircase. The bureau against the east wall, mahogany, 3 drawers on the right side, that locked with a small key that Margaret kept on her chatelaine. Eleanor had seen her open it exactly twice, both times when she hadn't known Eleanor was watching. Abigail knocked on the doorframe. How are you healing? Eleanor asked. I'm fine, Abigail said, and then caught herself. I'm asking about you, Miss Eleanor. How is your side? Better. It's better. She looked at Abigail. Abby, I need to go to Whitmore Hall. Abigail's face didn't move. Today. Today. Before the news about Reed's petition reaches her, before she has any reason to, she'll expect you to rest, the day after your wedding. Yes. And if she sees you, then I'm a new bride who wanted to collect a few things. Eleanor stood. I grew up in that house. I know every room. I know where she keeps things and why, and I know exactly how long she takes at the morning social calls she makes on Tuesdays. She met Abigail's eyes. It's Tuesday. Abigail was quiet for a moment. You'd need a reason that holds up. My mother's sewing box. She left it in the upstairs sitting room, and it was never included in anything transferred to Margaret's inventory. It's mine by any legitimate account, and no one could question me going to retrieve it. And while I'm there, I'm simply a young woman collecting her mother's things from the house she grew up in. And if the bureau is locked. Eleanor smiled, and it was the first smile she'd managed in 24 hours that had any real feeling behind it. My father gave me the spare key to that bureau when I was 16. He said. Her voice caught slightly, and she let it because Abigail was one of the 4 people in the world she was allowed to let it in front of. He said a woman should always know what's being decided about her life. She steadied. I've had it on a ribbon around my neck for 3 years. Abigail looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, I'll have the carriage ready in 20 minutes. Eleanor told Nathaniel. She did this not because she needed his permission. She was very clear in her own mind that she did not need his permission, and that if he tried to withhold it, the conversation would become significantly more direct. But because she had told him the previous afternoon that they were going to begin as honest, and she intended to hold to that even when it was inconvenient, she found him in the barn, which was not where she expected to find him, and she adjusted smoothly because she was good at adjusting. He was speaking with the man who managed the working horses, a conversation about the quality of last season's hay supply that seemed entirely genuine, and he looked up when she came in and said something brief to the manager and came to her. She told him. Quickly, clearly, with the relevant details and without unnecessary framing. He listened without interrupting. The key has been around your neck for 3 years, he said when she'd finished. Yes. And she doesn't know you have it. No, she thinks she has the only one. Eleanor watched him. I know it might seem rash, but the window is 3 to 5 days, and if she moves those letters before the preservation order... It doesn't seem rash, he said. It seems like the right use of the time available. He paused. I want to come with you. Eleanor blinked. That would, Nathaniel, your presence would announce itself. People know who you are. If you show up at Whitmore Hall the day after the wedding, Margaret's people will get word to her before we're through the door. Yes, he said. You're right. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through it, not resisting, not managing her, just actually thinking. Then you go. Abigail goes with you, and I'll be at Reed's office when you get back. You trust me to handle it. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she was beginning to interpret. Not warmth, exactly, not yet, but a kind of directness that was more honest than warmth, that had less of the social machinery built into it. You've been handling things on your own for 3 years, under considerably worse conditions, he said. I'd be an idiot not to. Yeah. She didn't quite know what to do with that. She was unused to being seen accurately by people who didn't intend to use what they saw. I'll be back before dinner, she said. Be careful, he said. I'm always careful. I know. He stopped. A brief something. I know you are. Be careful anyway. She turned to go, and then something stopped her at the door. She turned back. Nathaniel. Yes. Why did you actually say yes to my father? She watched his face. Not the reason you gave me in the parlor. I believe that I'm not questioning it. But there must have been something more specific. You could have said no. You had no obligation. He was quiet for a moment. The morning air moved between them. Your father said that you had never once in your life been spoken to as though your opinion of your own life mattered, he said. He said it like a man who was ashamed of it, like a man who knew he'd allowed a thing to happen that he should have prevented. Another pause. I thought if I had any capacity to be the kind of man he was describing when he talked about what he hoped for, then I should probably find out. Eleanor held that carefully. That's a significant thing to try to live up to, she said. Yes, Nathaniel said. It is. Whitmore Hall was quiet when the carriage arrived. This was expected. Margaret's Tuesday calls ran from 10 until noon, and the hall ran with a skeleton staff in her absence, people who had served the Whitmore household in various forms for years, and who looked at Eleanor when she came through the door with something she recognized as relief, not at the specific fact of her, at the general fact of a Whitmore being in the house. Mrs. Penny, who had been the housekeeper since Eleanor was 4, met her in the entrance with a composed face and eyes that said considerably more. Mrs. Ashford, she said, and Eleanor heard the catch in it. The new name, the strange sound of a familiar person in unfamiliar language. Mrs. Penny. Eleanor pressed her hand briefly. I've come for my mother's sewing box. I believe it's still in the upstairs sitting room. Of course. Mrs. Penny paused. Will you need any help? Abigail has it, thank you. Eleanor smiled. Is there anything pressing I should know about any staff concerns? This was the question Mrs. Penny had apparently been waiting 3 years for someone to ask her. She opened her mouth, and then she looked carefully at the doorway, and she lowered her voice. There are some things, she said, that I've been wanting to set down somewhere official, if you understand me. Some accounts of what I've witnessed in this house. Eleanor held her gaze. I understand you perfectly. I'll make sure you know where to bring those things very soon. She took the stairs at a measured pace. She said good morning to 2 housemaids she recognized from childhood. She walked down the upper hall as though she had every right to be there, which she did, and she paused at the door of her mother's sitting room long enough for appearance, and then she moved with Abigail, keeping pace and keeping watch to the second door on the left, Margaret's sitting room. The bureau was exactly where it had always been. Eleanor's hands were steady. She had done enough frightening things in the name of staying calm that her hands had learned to stay out of the matter. She reached under the neckline of her dress and drew out the key on its ribbon, small iron worn smooth at the bow from years of proximity to her skin, and she fitted it to the lock on the lower right drawer. It turned. The drawer held ledgers and correspondence and a small locked box that Eleanor did not have the key to, and set aside, and beneath them at the very back, tucked into an oilskin envelope that had been put there by someone who wanted it preserved, and hidden at the same time, a bundle of letters, her father's handwriting. She recognized it, the way she recognized the color of his eyes, or the sound of his laugh, immediately, viscerally, without any distance between recognition and feeling. Her hands were not in this moment entirely steady. She took the bundle. She took the ledgers, 2 of them, that had Whitmore property accounts on the spines, and which she had a legal right to as her father's heir. She closed the drawer and locked it and stood up. Abigail was watching the door. We need to go, she said quietly. I know. Now, Miss Eleanor. Eleanor tucked the oilskin envelope inside her traveling cloak against her uninjured side, and she picked up the 2 ledgers, and she walked out of the room and down the hall and down the stairs at exactly the pace she'd come up. She collected her mother's sewing box from the upstairs sitting room. She actually collected it because she was not going to leave this house without the one thing she'd come for officially, and because her mother had made a quilt in this box, and the quilt had gone somewhere, and Eleanor intended to find it, and she kissed Mrs. Penny's cheek at the door and said she would be in touch shortly, and walked to the carriage. They were 3 miles from Whitmore Hall before she allowed herself to open the oilskin. The letters were dated across 14 months, September of 1813 through October of 1814. 17 of them. Her father's hand, his particular looping descenders, the way he crossed his T's with a long stroke that always pulled left. She did not read them in the carriage. She could not have read them in the carriage. She held them closed, and she held herself together, and she breathed against the press of 3 years of missing him, and Abigail sat across from her and said nothing, and was exactly present in the way Abigail was always exactly present. At the 3rd mile she opened the first letter. Her father had written, My dear Eleanor, I am putting this down now because I am not certain how much time I have to put things down, and there are things you must know. The first is this. Everything in my possession is yours. Not your stepmother's, not the court's, yours by intention and by law. And I am writing these words to make certain that no document Margaret arranges can pretend otherwise. The second is this: I am sorry. I have been sorry for 12 years, and I will be sorry until I stop breathing, and I suspect it will follow me further than that. Eleanor stopped reading. She folded the letter carefully, precisely back into the envelope. She pressed her hand flat against the oilskin against 17 letters and 3 years of silence and the shape of what had been meant for her all along. Abby, she said. Her voice was completely steady. Miss Eleanor. He knew. She looked out the window at the moving Virginia countryside, summer green, abundantly alive, indifferent, and beautiful. He knew what she would do, and he spent 14 months writing everything down so I would have it. Abigail said very quietly, He loved you. Yes, Eleanor said. She pressed the envelope tighter against her ribs, against the bandaging, against the place where yesterday the silver clasp had bitten in, and where today the ache was something she could breathe through. "Yes," she said again. "He did." Reed's office was in a stone building on the main street of Richmond that had been practicing law since the city was young, and Nathaniel was already there when Eleanor arrived as promised. He looked at her when she came through the door, and his assessment was quick and complete, the way she was learning his assessments always were. She set the oilskin envelope on Reed's desk. The two men looked at it. Then Reed reached forward, glanced at Eleanor for permission, received her nod, and opened it. He read the first letter. He turned to the second. By the third, his expression had gone very still, in the way of a man who is recognizing the exact shape of what he has in his hands. "These are irrefutable," he said. "Not triumphant, just factual." "I know," Eleanor said. "This language," he pointed to a passage she hadn't reached yet. "He specifically anticipates a challenge to the guardianship. He names the properties by deed description. He references existing account balances." Reed set the letter down. "Eleanor, your father had legal advice when he wrote these." She looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said very quietly, "I referred him to a colleague, someone Margaret wouldn't know to look for." The room was quiet. "You've been holding this back," Eleanor said. "Not accusatory, just following the thread." "I've been waiting until there was something concrete to attach it to," he said. "What you brought today is concrete." A pause. "I should have told you sooner." "You should have," she said. "We'll add it to the list." Reed made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He pulled out a clean sheet of paper. "I'm filing immediately," he said. "With these documents, we're not asking the court to question Margaret's arrangement. We're asking them to recognize that it was never valid." He looked between them. "This is going to become public." "I know," Eleanor said. "People will talk." "They already talk," she said. "Let them have something accurate to say for once," Reed wrote. Nathaniel stood near the window with his hands behind his back, and his face doing the thing she was learning to read, not blank, not unfeeling, just quiet in the way of a man who was absorbing something larger than he'd entirely expected, and was deciding one piece at a time how to carry it. She came to stand beside him, not intending to particularly just the room arranging them that way. "He wrote to you about me," she said, quietly, not a question. "More than once," Nathaniel said. "What did he say?" "The rest of it. Not what you told me before." He looked at her for a long moment. "He said that you had your mother's backbone and his stubbornness, and that you'd spent 12 years being told the combination was a flaw." Another pause, smaller this time. "He said that whoever stood beside you would need to understand that they were standing beside you, not in front of you." Eleanor breathed. "He described you," Nathaniel said, "the way a man describes something he's proud of. The way a man talks about something he built and couldn't protect and needed to trust someone else to see." She looked at the window, at the summer street beyond it. Her father had seen her. He had always seen her. He had just run out of time to say so before she could hear it. "All right," she said after a moment. "All right. I'm not going to cry in Reed's law office," she said. "So I'm going to hold all of this until later, and then we're going to eat dinner, and then I'm going to read every one of those letters tonight, alone." She looked at him. "And tomorrow, we start whatever needs starting." Nathaniel looked at her. That almost not quite smile again, the one she was developing a vocabulary for. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Across the room, Reed set down his pen and said, "I have one more question before you go. Margaret is going to discover those letters are gone likely within the next few hours. When she does, she'll come to me directly," Eleanor said. "Yes." "I know." Eleanor straightened her gloves with the calm efficiency she reserved for things she had already decided. "Let her." Margaret arrived at Ashford Estate at 6 o'clock in the evening. Eleanor knew she was coming before the carriage reached the gate. Not because anyone told her, because she knew. Margaret knew the specific arithmetic of her anger. knew that the gap between the discovery and the arrival would be exactly as long as it took to compose herself into something that looked like concern rather than fury. Margaret did not arrive in fury. She arrived in layers, and the fury was always the last one, the one you didn't see until it was too late to step back from it. Eleanor was in the front parlor when Nathaniel's man came to say there was a carriage at the entrance, and she set down the letter she'd been reading her father's seventh, which was the one where he described the specific property boundaries of the Whitmore land, in the kind of precise legal language that had clearly been dictated to him by someone who knew what they were doing, and she folded it back into the oilskin with steady hands, and she went to the door herself. She did not wait for Margaret to be shown in. She opened the door and stood in it. Margaret came up the front steps with two of her household staff trailing behind her, which was a statement in itself. Witnesses or the appearance of them, and she was wearing her afternoon visiting dress, and her face was arranged in an expression of loving maternal worry that Eleanor had seen perform on a dozen different audiences over a dozen different years. "Eleanor," she said. "My darling, I've been so concerned." "Have you?" Eleanor said. "The whole county is talking about yesterday. About how you were taken from your own wedding breakfast by your husband, unannounced, no word to anyone, and I couldn't sleep for worrying." She reached forward and took Eleanor's hands in both of hers. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were measuring. "Are you well?" "I'm very well," Eleanor said. "Thank you for coming, Margaret. I'm afraid this isn't a good time." The grip on her hands tightened fractionally. "I've brought your winter things. You'll want them before the season turns." She glanced past Eleanor's shoulder into the entrance hall. "Perhaps we might sit." "I don't think so." Silence. A small, charged silence, the kind that exists between two people who both know what the conversation is actually about and are briefly negotiating whether to pretend otherwise. Margaret's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a degree or two, the way a well-built facade shows the first crack. "Eleanor, don't do this." "I'm not doing anything," Eleanor said. "I'm standing in my home." "Your home." Something in the word that wasn't quite a laugh. "You've been here one day." "Yes," Eleanor said, "and it's been a very productive one." Margaret looked at her, really looked for the first time without the social performance layered over it, and what Eleanor saw in her stepmother's eyes was not what she expected. It was not calculation. Not the cold strategic intelligence that Margaret usually kept carefully visible as a warning. It was something closer to fear. Dressed up in 12 different kinds of expensive fabric arranged to look like authority, but fear underneath all of it. This surprised her, and because it surprised her, it stopped her just briefly. "Come inside," Eleanor said differently than before. "Just you, not them." Margaret turned to her staff and dismissed them with a gesture. They stepped back to the carriage. Eleanor opened the door wider, and Margaret came in. Nathaniel was in the study, and Eleanor did not call him. This was a choice, and she made it deliberately. This conversation was hers. She sat across from Margaret in the front parlor, and she did not offer tea because she was not going to pretend this was a social call, and Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, with the practiced composure of a woman who had been performing composure for 51 years. "You went to the house," Margaret said. "I went to collect my mother's sewing box," Eleanor said, "which is mine. You went to my sitting room. I went to many rooms. I grew up there." Margaret's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Eleanor, what I took," Eleanor said, "was my father's correspondence addressed to me which you told me did not exist." She held Margaret's gaze without any anger in it, because she had spent the carriage ride home moving through anger and arriving at something cleaner on the other side. "You told me to my face on 4 separate occasions that those letters did not exist." "Your father was not well when he wrote." "He was entirely well," Eleanor said. "He was clear-minded and deliberate, and he had legal counsel, and he knew exactly what he was doing." She paused. "I think you knew that too. That's why you kept them." Margaret was quiet. Outside, the summer evening was doing its gradual work, the light beginning to change. "I did what I did." Margaret said finally, and her voice had shed several of its layers, to protect this family. Whose family? Both of ours. You protected your own position, Eleanor said. That's not the same thing, and you've always been too intelligent not to know the difference. Something crossed Margaret's face that Eleanor had never seen there before. It was quick, and it went deep, and it was gone before it could be named. But Eleanor thought, in the way she always thought about things, she couldn't prove yet that it might have been something like grief. The kind that lives alongside guilt. The kind that a person carries for years without ever naming it directly. Your father left that estate in a condition, Margaret said carefully, that was more precarious than you know. The debts were not. They were not theoretical. They were real, and they were significant. And the arrangements he made before he died were generous and idealistic, and did not account for what would actually be required to maintain that property through a difficult period. She stopped. I stabilized it. I kept the Whitmore name from public disgrace. I made decisions that were not comfortable, and I made them alone. I know, Eleanor said. Margaret blinked. I've read the accounts, Eleanor said. Reed has them. I can see what the estate owed when my father died, and what it owed 18 months later. You did stabilize it. She paused. And then you kept going, past the point where it needed stabilizing, past the point where there was any justification left except that you'd gotten used to the control. The room was very still. What happened to you? Eleanor said, and this was the part she hadn't planned to say. The part that came from somewhere she hadn't decided to open when you were young, before my father. When you learned that a woman's survival was about performance and endurance and never showing pain. She watched Margaret's face. Something happened. Margaret looked at her across the parlor with an expression that was entirely unreadable, except for the fact that it was for the first time in Eleanor's memory, unguarded. That, Margaret said quietly, is not something I am going to discuss. I know, Eleanor said, but I think it's the reason you did it. Not the only reason, but the root of it. She held her stepmother's gaze. It doesn't make it right. I want you to understand that I'm not saying it makes it right. But I think you genuinely believed that you were preparing me for a world that would treat me the way it treated you. And you used the tools that world gave you to do it. Silence. A long silence, longer than anything that had happened in this room so far. Margaret stood. She moved to the window and stood with her back to Eleanor, and Eleanor watched the set of her shoulders, and she thought about what her father had written in the 5th letter. Margaret is not a cruel woman. She is a frightened one, and she has never found the distance between those two things. I pray you will. What happens now? Margaret said, not to the window, just out into the room into the evening. Now. Eleanor said, Reed files the petition. The court reviews my father's letters and the property documents. The guardianship is dissolved. She paused. I've asked Reed to make no claim of fraud in the initial filing. The stabilization you performed will be credited. The excess afterward will be addressed as mismanagement rather than theft. Margaret turned. She looked at Eleanor with an expression Eleanor didn't have a name for. Why? She said. One word. Because you loved my father, Eleanor said. Imperfectly and selfishly, and in a way that made you make choices that hurt me, but you loved him. And he loved you in his way. And I am not interested in destroying you. I am only interested in what was mine being returned to me. Margaret stood very straight, and Eleanor watched something happen behind her eyes, something slow and enormous that didn't fully resolve before Margaret put it away in the private place where she apparently kept all enormous things. The dress, Margaret said, yesterday, was inexcusable, Eleanor said steadily. You know that. Margaret's lips pressed together. I wanted the marriage to hold. I thought... She stopped. I believed that if he saw weakness in you at the outset, he saw me bleeding, Eleanor said, and he left his own wedding breakfast to find a physician. She paused. That should tell you something about the kind of man my father chose. The room was quiet for a very long time. Then Margaret moved toward the door, and she paused with her hand on the frame, and without turning she said, Clara Bennett will testify to anything you need. I'll see to it." Eleanor sat very still. That was a great deal more than she had expected. "Thank you," she said. Margaret left without another word. Eleanor sat in the parlor and heard the front door close and heard the carriage move away, and she breathed in the specific way she breathed when something large had been navigated and the navigating was finished. She was still sitting there when Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. "I heard the carriage leave," he said. "Yes." "How did it go?" Eleanor thought about this honestly. "Better and worse than I expected," she said, "in different proportions than I anticipated." He came into the room and sat in the chair Margaret had just vacated, and he looked at her with the attentive quiet she was growing to rely on more than she'd expected to. "Tell me," she told him, "all of it." And when she reached the part about Margaret's offer regarding Clara Bennett, she watched something move through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration, the expression of a man adjusting his model of a situation. "Clara Bennett's testimony changes things significantly," he said. "I know. If she testifies to what was done to the dress, that's direct evidence of deliberate harm. Not mismanagement of accounts harm, physical, intentional harm." "I know," Eleanor said again, "which is why I didn't promise Margaret anything about how I'd use it." He looked at her. "I told the truth," she said. "I told her I wasn't interested in destroying her. That's true. But I also didn't tell her what I would and wouldn't do with the evidence once I have it." She held his gaze. "That felt like the honest version." "It is the honest version," Nathaniel said. "Are you certain you're comfortable with that? With me handling this the way I think it needs handling?" He looked at her steadily. "Eleanor, you are not asking my permission." "No," she said. "I'm asking your opinion." A pause, that almost not quite expression. "My opinion is that you handled that better than I would have," he said, "and that I'm learning more this week about the difference between protecting someone and trusting them than I've learned in the last decade." She held that quietly for a moment. "Clara Bennett," she said then. "I need to speak with her before Reed does, before Margaret has a chance to frame what Clara will say and how she'll say it. Tomorrow morning." "Tonight," Eleanor said. "Clara lives above her shop on Marshall Street. She'll be there." Nathaniel stood without comment. "I'll have the carriage ready." Clara Bennett was 38 years old, and she had the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been carrying something heavy and had been waiting without much hope for someone to come and help her put it down. She opened the door above her shop, and she looked at Eleanor, and her face did three different things in rapid succession: recognition, relief, and something that in any other circumstance might have been shame. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, "I was wondering when you'd come. May we come in?" Clara stepped back. Nathaniel stayed at the door. He had done this without being asked. Without discussion, had simply read the situation correctly, and positioned himself as present, but not the point. And Eleanor sat across from Clara at the small work table that still held pinned muslin and measuring ribbons. "Tell me," Eleanor said. "From the beginning," Clara told her. She told it the way people tell things they've been holding too long, quickly at first, then slowing down as the weight of it became more specific, then steadying into a kind of exhausted precision. Margaret had come to the shop 3 days before the wedding. She had brought the dress, which had already been fitted and finished, and she had told Clara that a modification was needed. The silver clasp at the left side seam, Clara had installed it at Margaret's original instruction, had been told it was a structural element, for the silhouette needed to be tightened. Not slightly, significantly. "She told me it was for posture," Clara said, and her voice was flat with the particular flatness of a woman who knew at the time exactly what she was being told, and had said it anyway. She said Eleanor had a tendency to favor her left side, and the dress needed to correct that before the ceremony. "And you believe that?" Eleanor said. Clara's hands were still on the table. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't believe that." She looked directly at Eleanor. "I did it anyway, because Mrs. Whitmore has directed more commissions my way in the last 3 years than any other client, and because I have 2 daughters and a shop that is barely managing, and because she told me that if I declined, she would ensure I had no custom left in this county worth having." Eleanor was quiet. "I know what that makes me," Clara said. "I've known since that morning when I came back and tightened it, and you were asleep, and I stood there in that room, and I—" She stopped, collected herself. "I'm telling you now, because it's the right thing, and I should have made it the right thing 3 days ago." "Yes," Eleanor said, "you should have." She let that sit for one honest beat. "But you're telling me now, and that matters. Will it?" Clara swallowed. "Will it come out publicly?" "What I did, what Margaret did," Eleanor said. "What you were coerced into. Those aren't the same." Clara looked at her with something raw in it. "You could make my life very difficult, Mrs. Ashford." "I could," Eleanor said. "I'm not going to." She paused. "But I need you to put what you've just told me in writing signed, and I need you to be willing to repeat it before a magistrate if it comes to that." Clara was quiet for the moment. Eleanor waited because she had learned in the last 2 days that there was a difference between a silence that was wavering and one that was deciding, and this was the second kind. "Yes," Clara said. "All right. Tonight?" Clara reached for a sheet of paper. Reed had the written statement in his hands by 8 o'clock that evening. He read it without expression, which Eleanor had come to understand was his expression of considerable feeling, and then he set it on top of the stack of documents that had been accumulating on his desk with the focused energy of a man watching a case assemble itself in real time. "This changes the nature of the filing," he said. "I thought it might," Eleanor said. "The letters establish intent with respect to the property, your father's clear wishes, Margaret's deliberate suppression of them. The financial records establish mismanagement and personal appropriation." He tapped the statement. "This establishes something that is not a civil matter. What was done to that dress with deliberate intent to cause physical harm on the day of your wedding, with a witness who can testify to the instructions given?" He paused. "Eleanor, this could be a criminal proceeding." The room was quiet. "I know," she said. "What do you want to do with it?" She had been thinking about this since Clara's shop. She had been turning it over in the carriage in the specific way she turned over things that were important, not circling, not anxious, but genuinely examining from each available angle to see which side held up under the most weight. "Hold it," she said. Reed looked at her. "Don't file the criminal elements separately. Keep it as part of the overall picture as evidence of the pattern of behavior, the length she was willing to go to maintain control. If the civil proceeding resolves fully and fairly, the criminal element stays where it is." She looked at Reed directly. "If it doesn't, then we use everything," Nathaniel said. He was standing near the door again. Eleanor had almost forgotten he was there, and then was immediately aware that she hadn't forgotten at all, that she had simply become comfortable with his presence in a way that was starting to feel natural, which was its own kind of remarkable thing. "Then we use everything," Eleanor confirmed. Reed nodded slowly. "That's a measured approach," he said. "It gives her an opportunity to cooperate with the civil resolution." "She came to me tonight," Eleanor said. "She offered Clara's testimony. She didn't have to do that. She could have told Clara to say nothing. She could have denied everything and made this slower and messier. She chose not to." She paused. "I think she's tired. I think she's been performing this particular role for 12 years, and my father dying took something out of it that she's been running on empty ever since." Another pause. "That doesn't excuse what she did, but it's information." Reed looked between her and Nathaniel with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years watching people navigate difficult circumstances and was watching someone navigate them particularly well. "I'll file tomorrow," he said. "Full civil petition, complete documentation, the statement included as exhibit." He gathered the papers. "The hearing will likely be scheduled within the month. The county magistrate is—" A careful pause. "He is sympathetic to clear documentation." "And the social response?" Nathaniel asked. when this becomes public. It will become public within the week, Reed said. There is no way to file a petition of this nature against a woman of Margaret Whitmore's standing without it becoming the primary topic of conversation in Richmond. I know, Eleanor said. They'll question your motives. There will be people, women especially, some of the older families who will see this as a new wife moving against a stepmother for social advantage. I know that too. And Eleanor stood. She smoothed her dress with the quiet, unconscious motion of a woman who has been straightening her own appearance for so long, it happens without thought. And they'll say what they say, she said, and eventually the letters will be read, and the accounts will be reviewed, and Clara Bennett's statement will be part of the official record, and the people who care about what's true will update their opinions, and the people who don't will keep theirs. She met Reed's eyes. I stopped making my decisions based on what Richmond might say about them approximately 48 hours ago. I'm finding it a significant improvement. Reed made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh again. I'll send word when the filing is confirmed. The week that followed was the longest of Eleanor's life, and also strangely one of the most alive. She read all 17 of her father's letters. She read them in order in the room that Nathaniel had told her was hers to use for any purpose spread across the writing table by lamplight, and she let herself feel each one properly. The grief and the guilt and the love and the complicated enormous relief of being known accurately by someone who was no longer there to know her. She wrote down everything she remembered that might be useful. Not for herself, she had a reliable memory, and she trusted it, but because Reed had asked her to put things in writing, and she had found in the process that writing things down changed them, made them more real or differently real, turned them from the private weight she'd carried alone into something that had edges and could be examined. She spoke to Mrs. Penny twice, once by letter and once in person, when Mrs. Penny came to Ashford Estate with a carefully prepared account of 3 years of witnessed events. Mrs. Penny was precise and specific and remarkably unafraid, and Eleanor thought that this too was something she hadn't considered, that there had been people around her all this time who had been watching and waiting and keeping their own careful accounting. She met the Ashford household staff, all of them, one by one, or in small groups, as the opportunity arose, not formally, but as it happened in the kitchen, in the stable yard, passing in the hall. She learned names, and she remembered them, and she asked questions, and she listened to the answers, and she could feel the household adjust to her, the way a living thing adjusts to a new element in its environment, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence as she proved to be consistent. Nathaniel watched this happen with an expression she was getting better at reading. He didn't interfere. He didn't manage or redirect or position himself between her and the household she was learning. He simply remained present and steady, and she was beginning to think genuinely interested in what she was doing and why. They ate dinner together every evening, and they talked, and this was the thing she had not predicted, and was not entirely sure how to account for. She had expected the conversation to be formal, structured, obligatory, the conversation of two strangers performing domesticity. Instead, it was actual. He told her about the tenant farmers and their specific situations, the family that had been struggling since the previous winter, and the one that was in dispute with its neighbor over a boundary line. She told him about the letters, about what her father had been like when she was small, before Margaret, before the fog of managing and being managed had settled over everything. He listened. He asked questions. Not performative questions, real ones, the kind that indicated he had actually been tracking what she said and wanted to know what came next. On the fourth evening, he said without particular preamble, "I owe you an account of something." She looked up from her plate. "My father," he said. "He was not well, as I told you, but the reason he wasn't well," he stopped, started again differently, the way people start again when they're navigating something they haven't said out loud before. "He drank heavily in the last decade of his life, and the estate suffered for it. I was 19 when I essentially took over the management, and I was angry about it for years, in the specific contained way that I was angry about things, quietly and completely, and without showing it to anyone." A pause. I was told repeatedly by people who were being helpful about it, that I became rather too controlled. that I was a man who could manage anything except a natural human response. Eleanor was very still. "I am telling you this," he said, "because you have been honest with me about things that cost you something to say, and it seems correct to be honest in return." He met her eyes. "And because I think that when you wonder, as I imagine you do wonder, whether I am able to feel things normally, and show them normally, you should have some information about why the answer to that is complicated." She sat with this. She sat with the image of a 19-year-old boy taking over a failing estate and locking himself up as tight as the Whitmore dress and running everything in the world except his own internal situation. "What did you do with it?" she asked. "The anger. I built things," he said. "I expanded the holdings, improved the tenancies, modernized the farming operations." He paused. "I became very productive. But I was very much alone for a very long time," he said, "and it came out simply without self-pity or performance. Just the fact of it, stated the same way he stated everything. And I became, I think, better at seeing things clearly than at feeling them." "That's not entirely a flaw," Eleanor said. "No, but it has limitations." He held her gaze. "You've already found several of them." "I have," she agreed. "You also left a legal notice in the county records office before your own wedding because you'd thought ahead enough to protect a woman you hadn't yet spoken to honestly. Those two things exist in the same person." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father said I was capable of it, of being what you'd need. He knew you better than he knew most people, I think," Eleanor said. "He had good instincts for character." She paused. "He was just imperfect at the follow-through sometimes." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "I think that's fair." The evening light moved across the room. Somewhere in the house, Abigail was doing something practical in the domestic way she did practical things, and outside the window, the Virginia summer was performing its indifferent abundance, and Eleanor sat across the dinner table from a man she had married 4 days ago, and thought that strange was not the right word for this, and neither was comfortable, but that there was something in the vicinity of both that was building itself into something she didn't have a word for yet. Reed sent word. Nathaniel said, shifting registers the way he did when he was moving them from the personal to the practical, smoothly, deliberately giving her the chance to follow or redirect. "The hearing is scheduled. 2 weeks from Thursday." 2 weeks, Eleanor said. The magistrate reviewed the petition and called it. Reed said he called it one of the clearest cases of documented misrepresentation he'd seen in 20 years. He paused. He may have specifically noted that the supporting documentation was remarkable. "My father was thorough," Eleanor said. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He was." She thought about what that meant. 2 weeks. 2 weeks until this became entirely public, until the Richmond she had grown up in turned its collective attention to the question of Eleanor Whitmore's father's estate and what Margaret had done, and whether Eleanor was a scheming new wife or a woman reclaiming what was hers. 2 weeks until she would have to stand in some form before an audience that had known her all her life and had never once asked what she actually wanted from it. She was not afraid. This, she thought, was new. She had been afraid for most of her adult life, not the sharp, sudden fear of immediate danger, but the chronic, low-grade fear of someone who lives perpetually at the mercy of someone else's decisions. It had been her background, her weather so constant, that she'd almost stopped noticing it was fear and had started calling it realism. It wasn't there right now. In its place was something harder and cleaner and significantly more interesting to live with. "The social calls have started," she said. "I had 4 this afternoon. Mrs. Haverford, the Carrington daughters, a woman from the church auxiliary whose name I didn't quite catch, and Mrs. Morrow from the county board." "What did they want?" "To assess the situation," Eleanor said. "To look at me in my new context and determine whether I'm what they've always assumed I was, or something else." She picked up her water glass. "I was hospitable and informative, and I showed them the sitting room, and I served very good tea. And I told every single one of them in appropriate social language and with a pleasant expression that I was very much looking forward to being an active participant in the community, and that I had several ideas about how Ashford resources might benefit the county." She paused. Mrs. Morrow seemed particularly interested in that. Mrs. Morrow, Nathaniel said, has 6 daughters and no sons, and is the most pragmatic woman in Richmond. If she's interested, it will be significant. I know, Eleanor said. I've always known. She held his gaze. I've had 12 years to study who matters in this county and why and how they make up their minds. I wasn't allowed to do anything with that knowledge before. He looked at her across the table with something that was more than that almost smile now, something that she thought with a careful internal surprise was closer to actual admiration. No, he said, you weren't. Well, Eleanor said simply, I am now. And outside the window, the Virginia summer held on green and vast and full of things growing. And in Reed's office on Marshall Street, a petition sat filed and waiting, and in Eleanor's chest the silver clasp sat in its small borrowed box, cool and exact, and no longer anyone's instrument but her own. 2 weeks, she thought. 2 weeks, and then it begins in earnest. She was ready. She had been ready for 3 years. She had simply been waiting for the ground under her feet to be solid enough to run on. It was solid now. The rumors reached Eleanor on a Monday, 8 days before the hearing. She was in the study, going through the second Whitmore ledger with Reed's junior clerk, a careful young man named Thomas, who had the useful quality of explaining financial irregularities without making her feel she should have caught them sooner when Abigail appeared in the doorway with a look on her face that Eleanor recognized immediately. Not alarm. Something more controlled than alarm, the expression Abigail wore when she had information she had already decided how to deliver. There's talk, Abigail said after Thomas had been excused. There's always talk, Eleanor said. This is specific talk. Abigail came in and closed the door behind her. Mrs. Carrington held a tea yesterday afternoon. Several of the older families were present. Someone, no one is admitting, who circulated a letter. Eleanor set down her pen. What kind of letter? The kind that raises questions about your father's mental state in the last year of his life. Abigail's voice was flat and precise, the way it got when she was angry and was choosing not to be. The letter suggests that his correspondence in that period may reflect a mind that was confused, easily influenced, and that a young woman with access to a dying man's affections might have shaped certain documents to her benefit. The room was quiet. She had someone write it, Eleanor said. I believe so. Not herself. She'd never put her name to something that direct. No, the letter has no signature. Abigail paused. But Mrs. Morrow sent word this morning, privately. She thought you should know. Eleanor sat back in her chair. She thought about her father, the specificity of his letters, the legal precision of them, the fact that Reed's colleague had helped structure them. She thought about the timeline, the dates, the medical records that existed, if anyone cared to pull them. She thought about her father sitting at his desk, writing 17 letters over 14 months, clear-eyed and deliberate, and running out of time and knowing it. She felt the anger move through her, clean and focused, and not at all the kind of anger that made a person careless. All right, she said. All right. Abigail watched her. She's scared, Eleanor said. She read the petition. She knows what the letters say, and she knows what Reed can demonstrate, and she's trying to poison the well before the magistrate drinks from it. She stood moving to the window, not for the view, but for the motion, the physical working through of it. This is what people do when the ground goes out from under them. They throw something into the air and hope it lands on your side of the line. What do we do? Eleanor turned from the window. We get Dr. Hartley. Abigail blinked. He treated my father in the last year of his life, Eleanor said. He made house calls. He kept records. I need to know what those records say about my father's condition, and I need to know if he's willing to speak to it. She was already moving toward the door. Where is Nathaniel? The Southfield. He said he'd be back by noon. Send someone for him. I need him now. Nathaniel arrived in 11 minutes, which told Eleanor something about how quickly he'd moved when the message reached him. He came in without having changed from working clothes, which was a detail she noticed, and filed, and he read the situation from her face before she'd said a word. Tell me, he said. She told him. He listened with that focused stillness, and when she finished, he said, "Hartley will talk. I'd stake a great deal on it." "You know him well." "He delivered me," Nathaniel said. "He's known this family for 40 years, and he's a man who has an extremely low tolerance for having medicine used as a weapon." He was already moving toward the desk. "I'll write to him directly. He'll come today." "The letter, whoever circulated it, is secondary," Nathaniel said. "Hartley's records are primary. If we can establish your father's clarity of mind through medical documentation before the hearing, the letter becomes noise." He looked at her. "Are you all right?" She almost said yes. She caught herself. "I'm angry," she said, "and I'm steady. Both at the same time." He held her gaze for a moment. "Good," he said. "You need both." Dr. Hartley arrived at 3 o'clock, and he came with his medical bag, even though Eleanor hadn't asked him to bring anything, which she took as a sign that he already understood the nature of the visit. He was a compact man with silver hair, and the particular directness of someone who had spent decades saying things people didn't want to hear and had learned to say them cleanly. He sat across from Eleanor, and he said before she could frame the request, "I've heard about the letter." "Already," she said. "Richmond is a small town dressed up as a city," he said. "Mrs. Morrow told half of her social circle by 10 this morning." He folded his hands. "Your father was my patient for 22 years, Mrs. Ashford. I attended him through his final illness. I know what his condition was and what it was not." His voice was entirely level. He was weakening physically. His mind was the last thing to go, and it did not go before he did. "The man who wrote those letters to you was as clear-headed as any man I've treated." "Would you put that in writing?" Eleanor asked. "I already have," he said, and he reached into his bag and produced 2 pages of careful medical documentation that he'd apparently prepared before leaving his office. Eleanor took the pages. She held them, and she looked at him across the table, and she said, "Why?" "Because it's true," he said simply. "And because your father told me when I was with him in the last weeks that he was worried you wouldn't have anyone who would just tell the truth clearly when you needed it." He paused. "He asked me to be that person if the situation arose. I reckon it has." The word reckon landed in the room with its plain American weight, and Eleanor thought about her father choosing this man, this direct and unfussy man, the same way he'd chosen Nathaniel, and she thought he was paying attention. Even at the end. Especially at the end. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Hartley said. "Use it." Fool. Reed had Hartley's documentation by 5 o'clock, and he sent a note back to Ashford Estate that said simply, "The letter is answered. Prepare for the hearing." That evening Margaret came again. This time Eleanor was not surprised. She had been half expecting it since the morning, because she understood now the rhythm of Margaret's responses: action, then recalibration, then a direct approach when the indirect one had failed. She had been managing Margaret in her own way for 12 years without knowing she was doing it, and now that she knew the pattern was almost readable as music. Margaret came in, and she sat in the front parlor, and she did not have her household staff with her, and she was not wearing her afternoon visiting composure. She was wearing something that looked considerably more like herself. "The letter was a mistake," Margaret said. Eleanor looked at her. "Yes. I didn't write it. I know, but you know who did, and you could have stopped it." Margaret's hands were in her lap, and they were not entirely still, which was the most revealing thing Eleanor had seen from her since this had all begun. "I panicked," she said. The word cost her. Eleanor could see the cost of it. "I read the petition, and I saw what Samuel Reed had assembled, and I panicked. I told Gerald Haverford that the letters might reflect a period of I said something I shouldn't have, and he took it further than I intended." "Gerald Haverford wrote it," Eleanor said. Not a question. She'd had her own guess about the unsigned letter's author. Margaret said nothing, which was its own answer. "He's been wanting to cause trouble for the Ashford family for 15 years. Nathaniel said. He was in the room this time, seated near the window with his coffee, and Eleanor had asked him to stay. He lost a land dispute to my father in 1802 and has never fully made his peace with it. He saw an opportunity, Eleanor said. And I gave it to him, Margaret said quietly. I know. The room held that. Margaret, Eleanor said, I'm going to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. I'll try. Did you know before the wedding? Did you know that the clasp would injure me that significantly? The silence that followed was not the silence of a woman composing a lie. It was the silence of a woman facing something she had been avoiding looking at directly. I knew it would be uncomfortable, Margaret said finally. I told myself that was different. She looked at Eleanor, and in her eyes was something Eleanor thought might be the most honest thing she'd ever seen from her. I don't know how much I believed that, and how much I simply needed to believe it. Eleanor let that sit. There's a difference, she said carefully, between what you're willing to look at and what you're willing to do. You've always known where that line was. I think you went further past it than you meant to, and I think you've known that since the moment Dr. Hartley was called. Margaret's lips pressed together. What do you want from me, Eleanor, truly? I want you to appear at the hearing, Eleanor said. I want you to be present, and I want you not to contest what's being presented, and I want you to respond honestly when the magistrate asks you questions. She paused. That's all. That's the only thing I want from you now. That's... Margaret stopped. You understand what that will mean. For my standing in this community, if I sit there and don't contest, I understand, Eleanor said. Yes, they'll know I'm not fighting it. They'll draw their own conclusions. They'll draw their own conclusions regardless, Eleanor said. The question is whether those conclusions are about a woman who made mistakes and faced them, or about a woman who made mistakes and kept making them. Margaret was very quiet for a long time. Your father, she said. He would have hated this. He would have hated that it was necessary, Eleanor said. He would not have hated me for doing it. Margaret stood. She was still composed, still perfectly upright, still every inch the woman Richmond had known for 20 years. But something in it was different now, and Eleanor thought it might be that the composure was resting on something real underneath it, instead of floating over an absence. I'll be there, Margaret said. I won't contest it. She left, and Nathaniel set down his coffee cup, and Eleanor sat for a moment with the specific weight of what had just happened. She'll hold to it, he said. You think she'll hold to it? Yes, Eleanor said. I think she's been looking for a door for a long time. She paused. Not out of guilt, out of exhaustion. There's a difference. You keep finding differences that most people don't bother looking for, he said. She looked at him. Is that a flaw? No, he said. It's how you survived 12 years without becoming what they wanted you to be. She held that carefully and put it somewhere she could return to. The 6 days between Margaret's second visit and the hearing were not quiet days. The unsigned letter had done its work in certain circles, and Eleanor was aware through Abigail, through Mrs. Morrow's careful social intelligence, through the particular quality of the calls she received, and the ones she didn't, that Richmond had divided itself into camps, the way it always divided itself when a prominent family's affairs became public. There were those who were waiting to see how it resolved before choosing a position. There were those who had decided on the basis of the letter and their existing sympathies that Eleanor was ambitious and opportunistic. And there were those, a smaller and more definite group, who had been watching the Whitmore situation for 3 years with their own private accounting and were quietly waiting for someone to do exactly what Eleanor was doing. Mrs. Morrow fell into the third category. She called on Eleanor on the Wednesday before the hearing, and she came directly the way Eleanor was learning that Mrs. Morrow always came directly to the point. There are 7 women in this county, Mrs. Morrow said, who have had variations of your situation. Not identical, but similar. A woman's assets managed by someone other than herself, correspondence-controlled social movement managed. The specifics vary. She looked at Eleanor steadily. None of them have had the documentation you have. I know, Eleanor said. If this hearing establishes a clear precedent, if Reed structures the argument correctly, it will matter beyond your particular case. Reed knows that, Eleanor said. We've discussed it. Mrs. Morrow nodded. Good. A pause. I want you to know that I did not believe the letter, and that I've said so specifically to 14 people in the last 4 days. Eleanor looked at her. Why, you barely know me. I knew your father, Mrs. Morrow said. And I know a woman who spent 20 years being managed when I see one because I spent 15 years being one myself before my husband died and left me the liberty of my own mind. She stood. We don't say these things to each other enough. We pretend it isn't happening to the woman beside us, because if we see it, we have to see it in our own lives, and that's frightening. She picked up her gloves. I'm tired of being frightened. After she left, Eleanor sat for a long time with those words. I'm tired of being frightened. She thought about how long she'd had those exact words in her chest without knowing how to say them. The night before the hearing, Eleanor couldn't sleep. This was not unusual. She had slept poorly for most of her adult life, the chronic light sleep of someone who lived in a state of managed alertness, but this was a different quality of wakefulness. Not anxious. Too awake for anxiety. She lay in the dark, and she ran through everything. The letters, the ledgers, Hartley's documentation, Clara's statement, Reed's argument, the specific questions the magistrate would likely ask, the order in which things would need to be presented. She heard Nathaniel's door. Not footsteps. She heard the slight sound of a door that doesn't quite latch, the kind of detail you notice in a house you've been in for 2 weeks, and whose rhythms you've already started to learn. Then, footsteps moving toward the stairs, moving down. She waited 3 minutes. Then she got up. He was in the study at the desk with a lamp burning low and a letter in front of him that he wasn't reading so much as looking at. He looked up when she came in and did not seem surprised. You couldn't sleep either, she said. I slept for 2 hours, he said. It was sufficient. She sat in the chair across from the desk. The lamp threw warm light across the room, and outside the window, the Virginia night was full of summer insects and the occasional far sound of something moving through the dark. What are you worried about? She asked. He looked at her. Tell me what you think I'm worried about. I think, she said carefully, that you're worried about whether I'm ready. Not in the practical sense. You know, I'm prepared, you've watched me prepare. But whether I'm armored enough for what it's going to feel like to stand in front of that room tomorrow and have people look at me the way they're going to look. He was quiet. And I think, she continued, that you're also worried about whether you're going to be able to sit there and watch that happen without doing something that would be more about your feelings than my situation. The corner of his mouth moved. Not the not quite smile. Something more than that. That's accurate, he said. I'm going to be all right, she said. Not because it won't be hard, but because I've been preparing for exactly this kind of room my entire life. The only difference is that tomorrow I get to say the true thing instead of the managed one. She held his gaze. I've been waiting for that since I was 16 years old. He was quiet for a moment. Your father told me you were like that, he said. He said you had the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself, the kind that's just there, underneath, regardless. He was generous, Eleanor said. He was accurate, Nathaniel said. I've been watching you for 2 weeks and I've found no evidence against it. She looked at him across the desk and thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone who was paying actual attention. Not the social attention of a room that looked at you and saw your dress and your family name. The real kind. The kind that tracked what you said against what you did and noticed when they matched. I'm glad my father found you, she said. I want you to know that. I wasn't sure in the beginning, but I am now. He held her gaze. I'm glad he found me too, he said. I was... A pause, the kind where he was choosing precision. I was becoming someone who managed things very well and felt very little about any of it. I had made a kind of peace with that. Another pause. I'm finding I'd rather not. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the night moved through its slow summer hours. Go back to sleep, Eleanor said, standing. You'll need to be present tomorrow, and I need you thinking clearly, not admirably exhausted. He made a sound that was unmistakably an actual laugh, small, contained, but real. Yes, ma'am, he said, and the Virginia phrasing in his mouth was unexpectedly warm. She went back upstairs, and she did sleep eventually with the silver clasp on the bedside table where she'd put it the first night, and where it had remained, and she slept better than she had in 3 years. Chai. The county magistrate's hall was a stone building on the east side of Richmond that smelled like old wood and legal documentation and the particular seriousness of a room that had heard difficult things for a long time. Eleanor arrived at 9 o'clock with Nathaniel beside her and Reed on her left, and Abigail a careful 3 steps behind, and she was wearing a dark blue dress that she had chosen because blue was her color, and because she was not going to dress as a supplicant. The hall was fuller than she had expected. This was the first thing. She had known there would be observers. These proceedings were technically public, but the number of people already seated when she walked in told her that word had spread further and faster than Reed had predicted. She recognized faces. County families' merchants, several of the women who had called on her in the past 2 weeks, 3 men who she was fairly certain were connected to the Haverford family. Gerald Haverford himself, seated near the back, with an expression of careful neutrality. Margaret was there. She was seated on the far side of the room, alone. No Haverford allies, no social circle arranged around her. Just Margaret, upright and still in a gray dress looking straight ahead. She did not look at Eleanor when Eleanor came in. But she did not look away either. Clara Bennett was there, in the 3rd row, with her hands in her lap and her chin up. Mrs. Morrow was there, with 2 of the women Eleanor had met in the last 10 days, sitting on either side of her. Dr. Hartley was there. Mrs. Penny was there with 2 of the Whitmore housemaids. Eleanor took her seat. Reed arranged his documents. The magistrate, a man named Horace Aldridge, who had the weathered patience of someone who had been adjudicating county disputes for 25 years, took his position at the front and called the room to order. Reed presented first. He was systematic and clear, and Eleanor had heard the argument enough times to follow its structure without needing to track every word, which let her watch the room instead. She watched faces move through the presentation. The early skepticism of several of the older men. The careful attention of the women. The specific moment when Reed read the first of her father's letters aloud, and she heard the quality of the silence change. It changed because the letter was unmistakably real. Her father's voice was in it direct and particular, and alive in the way that a voice is alive when it's saying something it genuinely means, and you could not hear it and honestly believe it was the product of a confused mind. She watched Gerald Haverford's expression. She watched it go from careful neutrality to something more uncomfortable. Reed presented the financial documentation. He presented Hartley's medical records, and Hartley was called to speak briefly, and was brief and definitive, and entirely unassailable. He presented Clara's statement, and there was a murmur in the room when its contents were read aloud. Not dramatic, just the collective intake of a group of people processing something they hadn't expected to hear that specifically. Then Magistrate Aldridge said, "I'd like to hear from Mrs. Ashford directly if she's willing." Eleanor stood. The room went very still. She had been thinking about this moment since the morning after the wedding. She had run through versions of what she might say, different approaches, different tones measured and legal or emotional or direct and factual. She had considered and discarded each of them, and she had arrived the previous week at the only version that was actually true. She was going to say the thing she meant. "I want to be clear about what I am asking the court for," she said, and her voice was steady and it carried without being raised, and she was aware of the room attending to it. "I am not asking for punishment. I am asking for recognition." She paused. "My father spent the last year of his life writing as clearly as he knew how about what he wanted for me. He wrote it down 17 times. He had legal counsel. He was deliberate about it in the way a man is deliberate when he knows he is running out of time and does not want the time to run out on the wrong things." She looked at the magistrate. "Those letters were kept from me. The assets he described in them were managed in a way that contradicted his stated intentions. I am asking this court to acknowledge what he wrote and restore what he intended. A breath, a real breath, not the managed kind. I want to say something else," she said. "Not for the record, but because this room is full of people from this county, and I have lived in this county my entire life." She looked out at the faces, at Mrs. Morrow, at Clara, at Mrs. Penny with her hands folded. Silence is not the same as acceptance. I was silent for 3 years because I had no ground to stand on. And I knew it. And so did the person who arranged it that way. What I am asking this court to do is give women in this county, give people in this county, something that silence cannot give. The acknowledgement that what happened was real, that it was documented, that it was wrong. She paused. That is all. She sat down. The room was quiet for 3 full seconds, which in a courtroom is a very long time. Then Nathaniel put his hand over hers on the table. Not a gesture for the room, not performed. Just his hand over hers, quiet and steady, and she turned her hand over and held it. Magistrate Aldridge looked at his papers. He looked at Margaret. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "the court would hear your response to the petition." Margaret stood. She stood and she straightened, and she was to the end exactly as upright as she had always been. "I do not contest the petition," she said. Her voice was clear. "The documentation is accurate. The letters are genuine. The management of the Whitmore assets went beyond what was authorized or appropriate." She paused. "I am prepared to cooperate fully with whatever review the court deems necessary." The murmur in the room was louder this time. Aldridge looked at her over his papers. "You understand what this acknowledgement means for the petition's resolution?" "I do," Margaret said. "Yes." She sat. She did not look at Eleanor. But Eleanor, watching her, saw the specific quality of a person who has set something down that they have been carrying too long, and she recognized it because she had just done the same thing. Aldridge deliberated for 22 minutes. Reed had told Eleanor to expect longer, and she had prepared for longer. But 22 minutes later, the magistrate returned, and he ruled clearly. The guardianship arrangement was dissolved. As of that date, all Whitmore assets were transferred to Eleanor's direct control. The financial records were to be reviewed by a court-appointed auditor, and any improper appropriations were to be returned within 90 days. He did not speak to the dress. The criminal question stayed where Eleanor had decided to keep it filed, but not filed a door she held the key to and chose not to open. The civil resolution was full, and it was fair, and it was enough. When Aldridge's gavel came down, the room moved conversations, starting people rising the particular social reorganization that happens when a large group of people has collectively witnessed something and needs to process it together. Eleanor stood, and Reed shook her hand with genuine warmth, and Nathaniel stood beside her, and the room moved around them. Mrs. Morrow reached her first. "Well done," she said, and pressed Eleanor's hand with both of hers. "That was well done, young lady." Then Clara Bennett, with her chin still up and her eyes bright. "Thank you," Clara said, for giving me the opportunity to be honest." "You gave yourself that opportunity," Eleanor said. "I just provided the room." Mrs. Penny arrived in a small cluster with her housemaids, and she was crying in the efficient way of a woman who does not often cry and is not comfortable with it. And Eleanor held her hands and said quietly, "He knew you were loyal to him. He told me so in one of the letters. He said Mrs. Penny would keep the house right no matter what." Mrs. Penny pressed her lips together very hard. "He was a good man," she said. "He was," Eleanor said. "He was." She looked across the room. Margaret was standing near the far wall alone, and people were giving her a particular kind of space. Not hostile, just uncertain, the social uncertainty of a room that hadn't finished deciding what it thought yet. Margaret was standing straight and looking at nothing, and she had Eleanor thought more dignity in this moment than she'd had in a very long time, because it was real dignity now, the kind that comes from having faced something, rather than from having successfully avoided it. Eleanor moved through the room and crossed to her. Margaret looked at her when she came close, and her expression was not something Eleanor could name precisely. It was somewhere between exhausted and careful, and something else, something deeper. "You didn't have to tell him not to contest," Eleanor said. "That was your choice." "Yes," Margaret said. "I want you to know I see that. Whatever comes next, Whatever the auditor finds, and however the 90 days resolve, I see that you made a choice this morning." Margaret was quiet. Then she said very low, "What your father wrote in those letters, did he—" She stopped. "Did he say anything about me?" Eleanor thought of the 5th letter. Margaret is not a cruel woman. She is a frightened one. She thought of the 10th where he had written, "I hope Eleanor will find a way to be both fair and free when she deals with the consequences of my choices. I hope she will not need to carry my mistakes as well as her own." "He said he hoped you'd both find peace," Eleanor said. It was true in its way, the truth the situation called for. Margaret nodded once. She turned and walked toward the door, and she carried herself well as she always did, and people moved aside for her, and she left. Nathaniel was at Eleanor's shoulder. "Are you ready to go home?" he said. Home. The word landed differently than it would have 2 weeks ago. Ashford Estate was not the house she'd grown up in, but it was the house where her father's letters were in a box in her room, and her mother's sewing box was on the shelf in the study, and Abigail moved through the halls with increasing ease, and Mrs. Morrow came to tea, and the ledgers were hers to read and the rooms were hers to fill. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Take me home." They walked out of the magistrate's hall into the full Virginia summer, and the heat hit them like something living, and Eleanor tilted her face up toward it. For one unguarded moment, eyes closed. Sun on her face, the sounds of Richmond moving around her like a river. She no longer had to fight. Then she opened her eyes. She squared her shoulders. She took Nathaniel's arm, and they walked. The auditor arrived on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the hearing, and he was a thin, methodical man named Mr. Graves. Not Thomas Graves, the solicitor who had drawn up Margaret's guardianship arrangement, which was a different Graves entirely, and an unfortunate coincidence that Reed had already noted with dry humor, and he installed himself in the Whitmore Hall study with the Whitmore ledgers and proceeded to do what auditors do, which is to make the invisible visible in the most uncomfortably specific way possible. Eleanor did not go to Whitmore Hall during the audit. This was a deliberate choice, and it cost her something, because her instinct was to be present for everything now, to stand in every room where decisions about her life were being made, and make sure those decisions were being made correctly. But Reed had told her clearly that her presence would complicate the auditor's independence, and she had listened because she had learned in the weeks since the hearing to distinguish between the situations that required her direct action and the ones that required her to trust that the machinery she had set in motion would continue moving. This was one of the second kind. So she stayed at Ashford Estate, and she worked. There was, it turned out, a great deal to work on. The Whitmore property review was the most pressing, but alongside it ran the daily reality of Ashford Estate itself. The household, the tenancies, the farming operations that Nathaniel had been managing alone since he was 19, and that he had now, with the practical ease of a man who had long since stopped performing either authority or its absence, simply opened to her. Not handed over. Opened. The distinction mattered to both of them. She spent 3 mornings with the estate manager going over the tenant situations that Nathaniel had described at dinner in their first week. The family struggling since winter turned out to be the Calloway family. 7 people in a farmhouse with a roof that had needed attention since the previous autumn, and had not received it because there were always more urgent things and less money than the list of urgent things required. Eleanor had walked through the situation with the estate manager, and she had said plainly, "Fix the roof," and the manager had explained the cost, and she had said, "I understand the cost, fix the roof." That same afternoon, she had written 3 letters to the county board to a woman named Mrs. Sarah Doyle, who ran a small school in the eastern part of the county, and to Mrs. Morrow, who had offered in the weeks since the hearing to use her social network as a kind of practical resource for anything Eleanor was trying to accomplish. Eleanor was trying to accomplish several things. She was learning to ask for help with the same directness she'd applied to everything else, which was more unfamiliar than she'd expected, and considerably more effective. Abigail watched all of this with the expression of a woman who had waited a long time for something, and was now watching it arrive, and was not entirely sure she'd adequately prepared herself for the size of it. "You're different," Abigail said one evening when they were in Eleanor's room, and Eleanor was writing in the ledger she'd started keeping of her own affairs, not Whitmore's accounts, not Ashford's, but a running record of what she was doing, and why, and what she thought about it. "I know," Eleanor said without looking up. I don't mean changed. I mean more. Like there was always this much of you, and it just had nowhere to go." Eleanor set the pen down. She looked at Abigail, who was folding laundry in the quick, competent way she did everything, and she thought about 12 years of a woman watching another woman be slowly compressed into a smaller and smaller version of herself, and staying and keeping the kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself. "Abigail," she said, "I want to talk to you about something." "All right. I want to increase your wage, significantly, and I want to discuss what you actually want, not what this household needs, not what I need, what you want. Whether that's to continue here, or to do something else, or to have a position with more responsibility, or—" "Eleanor." Abigail had stopped folding. She was looking at her directly, and her voice had the careful steadiness of someone managing something larger than they want to show. "I'm exactly where I want to be." "You're sure?" "I've been with you since we were children. I'm not going anywhere because you gave me more money and better options." A pause. "But yes to the money." Eleanor laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere uncomplicated. "Yes to the money," she agreed. "Better." The auditor's report arrived on a Tuesday 23 days after he'd begun, and it was delivered to Reed's office rather than to Eleanor directly, which was proper procedure and which Eleanor accepted with the patience she was building in herself. The way you build muscle incrementally, with consistent application, and with the occasional moment of wanting to throw the whole project out the window. Reed summoned her and Nathaniel together, which Eleanor took as a sign that the report was significant enough to require a combined response. It was significant. The total amount of improper appropriation from the Whitmore estate accounts over the 3-year period, Reed said, and his voice had that particular careful flatness that meant he was managing his own reaction to what he was about to say, is considerably higher than we estimated. Eleanor kept her face exactly as it was. "How considerably?" Reed told her. The number sat in the room. "That's," Nathaniel began. "A great deal," Eleanor said. She was running the numbers in her head the way she'd learned to run numbers quickly and without sentimentality. "The estate can absorb the recovery. The Whitmore property has been generating income through the tenancies. If the appropriation is returned within 90 days as the court ordered, it will be," Reed said. "Margaret has retained her own attorney and has already begun liquidating personal assets to meet the obligation. She intends to comply fully." He paused. "Her attorney contacted me yesterday. She's also prepared to transfer Whitmore Hall itself to your direct ownership and relocate. She says she has a cousin in Philadelphia." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I didn't ask for the house," she said. "No, she's offering it." Reed looked at her carefully. "You grew up there." "I know." She thought about Whitmore Hall, the room she'd moved through for 12 years, the staircase her mother had descended every morning, the kitchen where Mrs. Penny had fed her biscuits when she was small, the bureau with the lock that she'd opened with a key around her neck. "Tell her attorney I'll think about it." "Eleanor," Nathaniel said. He was looking at her with that specific quality of attention that she'd been married to for a month now and had not yet stopped finding remarkable. "What do you actually want to do with it?" She looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said, "and I'm learning not to make decisions I don't know about yet." He held her gaze. "That's new." "It's very new," she said. "I'm trying to keep it." What happened next was not something Eleanor had planned, and planning was by now very much her habit. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days after Reed's report, when Eleanor was in the Ashford study working on a letter to Mrs. Doyle about the Eastern County School, specifically about whether the current space was adequate for the number of girls who were now attending, which it was not, and about what it would take to expand it, which Eleanor had been calculating in the margins of the letter for the last 20 minutes. A woman arrived at the door, not a social caller. Eleanor heard her voice in the entrance low, uncertain, the voice of someone who was not accustomed to arriving at houses like this one and was managing the unfamiliarity with dignity. Nathaniel's man showed her into the front parlor and a moment later came to Eleanor's study with the woman's card. Her name was Anne Grayson. Eleanor didn't recognize it. She went to the parlor. Anne Grayson was perhaps 35, with the particular economy of movement of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible, and she stood when Eleanor came in, and she said immediately, "I'm sorry to call without notice. Mrs. Morrow suggested I might. She said you were a person who would listen." "Sit down," Eleanor said. "Tell me." Anne Grayson sat and she told her. It took 20 minutes, and it was the kind of story that Eleanor recognized the architecture of immediately, not the specific details, but the shape. A husband who had died 18 months ago. Assets that were technically Anne's, but that her husband's brother had been managing at first helpfully and then less so. Correspondence that had been redirected. Documents that had been moved. A woman who had tried to ask questions and had been told gently and then less gently that she didn't understand these things and shouldn't worry herself. Eleanor listened to every word. When Anne finished, Eleanor said, "Do you have any of your husband's original paperwork?" "Anything in his hand. Some letters, and the original property deed. I kept that hidden. I had a feeling." "Good?" Eleanor said. "That feeling was correct. Hold on to it." She stood. "I'm going to write you a letter of introduction to Samuel Reed. He is the best attorney in Richmond, and he takes cases on their merit. Bring him everything you've kept." She paused. "And I want you to know what you're describing is not confusion on your part. It is not failing to understand things you should understand. It is someone taking advantage of the fact that you were grieving and alone and didn't have a door." Anne Grayson looked at her with something in her face that Eleanor recognized from the inside, that specific look of a person who has been told the true thing about their situation for the first time and is working out whether to believe it. "A door," Anne said. "Everyone needs one," Eleanor said. "That's what I've learned." After Anne left, Eleanor stood in the front parlor for a moment, and she thought about Mrs. Morrow saying, "We don't say these things to each other enough." She thought about her father's 10th letter. "I hope she will not need to carry my mistakes as well as her own." She thought about what it meant to have a door, not a rescue, not a gift, but a door, a legal and social and practical opening through which a woman could walk on her own feet and be seen clearly and have her situation treated as real. She went back to the study. She finished the letter to Mrs. Doyle, which now included a postscript about funding. Then she wrote 3 more letters to Reed introducing Anne Grayson, to the county board regarding a proposal she'd been developing for the past week, and to a woman named Mrs. Patricia Lowe, whom Mrs. Morrow had mentioned twice in passing as someone who had been in a situation similar to Eleanor's 10 years ago and had never found resolution. She sent all 4 letters before dinner. Nathaniel found her at the writing desk at 7:30 in the specific quality of evening light that comes in late summer when the day has been long and productive and is finally willing to let go. "Reed sent word," he said. "The 90-day deadline is going to be met early. Margaret's attorney confirmed the assets will be fully transferred within the week." "Good," Eleanor said. "The Whitmore Hall question. I've decided," she said. She turned to face him. "I'm going to accept the transfer. But I'm not going to live there." He waited. "I'm going to give it to the school." She watched his face. "Mrs. Doyle's school, the one in the Eastern County, has outgrown its space. Whitmore Hall has 8 rooms in regular use and a full kitchen and grounds. If it becomes a permanent school for girls in this county..." She stopped. "It's what my mother would have wanted. She cared about education very specifically. She used to say that a woman who can read her own contracts is a woman who cannot be easily deceived." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "The property's yours to decide," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I'm telling you because I want to, not asking permission." "I know you're not," he said. Something in his voice that was warm in the uncomplicated way warmth sometimes surprised her, from him, not performed, not constructed just there. "I'm glad you told me." Are you glad about the decision itself? He came and sat in the chair across from the desk, and he was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was being accurate rather than agreeable. I think, he said slowly, that it is a very good use of something that caused you a great deal of pain. And I think that transforming things that caused you pain into things that help other people is... He paused. It's exactly what I would expect from you, and I find that I am consistently more moved by your expectations than I anticipated. Eleanor looked at him. That is a very complicated way of saying you approve. I'm a complicated man, he said. You knew that. I'm learning it, she said. There's a difference. He held her gaze, and she held his, and between them was the particular quality of a silence that had come a long way from a formal parlor, and a strange hallway, and a small room with a physician and 17 letters, and a magistrate's gavel, and all the days in between, and that had arrived somehow here. At two people who had not chosen each other in the traditional sense, and had found in the not choosing something more reliable than most choices. Nathaniel, she said. Yes, I want to say something I haven't said directly yet. He waited. He was good at waiting, and she was getting better at using it. I am grateful, she said carefully, for what you did before the wedding, the legal notice, the preparation, what you said to Reed before I even knew who Reed was. She held his gaze. But I want you to know that's not why I trust you. I trust you because of what you did in the hallway at the Haverford house when there was nothing strategic about it and no document involved. You stood in a dim hall and you asked me if I was injured, and you meant it as a question, not a problem to be solved. She stopped. That was the thing, not the legal architecture, that. His jaw worked slightly. She had learned that this was what he looked like when something was getting through in a way that bypassed his defenses. All right, he said quietly. I'm not finished, she said. I also want to say, I know this is not the kind of marriage you'd planned for. I know you agreed to this expecting something more manageable. A woman with an asset dispute and a grateful disposition who would run your household and cause you minimal complication. The corner of his mouth moved. That is not what I expected. It's not what you got, she agreed. No, he said. What I got is significantly better and approximately 3 times more work. She laughed the same real, uncomplicated laugh from when she'd laughed with Abigail, and she thought that this was new too, laughing like this in front of him and that she was going to keep doing it. I'm aware, Eleanor. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and his voice had come down to that register she knew was reserved for things he meant entirely. I want to say my own thing now. All right. I told you early on that I was becoming someone who managed things well and felt very little about any of it. He looked at her directly. I want you to know that is no longer accurate. What I feel about my life at this moment, about this house, and what you're building in it, and what you're building in this county, and what it means to watch you do it. He stopped. It's considerable. I don't have very polished language for it, and I'm aware that's a limitation, but I want you to know the feeling is there, even when the words aren't. Eleanor held that. She held it the way she'd learned to hold things that were important, not too tight, not at arm's length, but present with them. I know, she said. I can tell. A pause. And for the record, you have better language than you give yourself credit for. You've said several things to me in the past month that I've been thinking about ever since. Such as, a woman does not need someone to own her pain. She needs someone willing to believe it. She watched his face. You said that on the 4th day. I've carried it since. He was quiet for a moment. Your father said something like it first, he said. I was 26. I'd just made a decision about one of the tenant families, a decision that was in retrospect correct, but completely failed to account for how the woman involved actually felt about it. Your father looked at me, and he said the problem, Nathaniel, is that you are so determined to solve things that you forget to ask whether the person in the situation feels solved or just moved. He paused. I've been working on it ever since. Eleanor thought about her father saying that to a 26-year-old Nathaniel Ashford, and she thought about what kind of man had that conversation and kept it for 9 years and tried to act on it. She thought about her father's instincts about the choices he'd made at the end of his life, about the architecture of care that she'd been living inside without knowing it was there. "He was paying attention," she said softly, "all the way to the end." "Yes," Nathaniel said. "He was." Yaking. The first week of September brought a change in the air. Still summer, but with something in it that suggested the turn was coming, the slight edge that meant the endless Virginia heat would not in fact be endless. Eleanor noticed it on a morning when she walked out to meet the estate manager and felt it on her face, and she stopped for a moment, just a moment with it. Abigail had arranged the sewing box on the shelf in the study the previous week, and Eleanor had been opening it every few days, not to do anything specific, just to look at the contents, the threads and needles, and the small, folded square of fabric that was all that remained of the quilt her mother had been working on when she died. It was enough. More than enough. Mrs. Morrow had become a regular caller, which had evolved from social obligation into something that felt more like friendship, and which Eleanor was cautious about, and then decided to stop being cautious about, because caution was appropriate when you couldn't trust your own judgment, and she was learning by increments to trust it. Anne Grayson's situation had proceeded more quickly than anyone expected. Reed had looked at her documentation and declared the case straightforward, and the brother-in-law, confronted with the actual paperwork and the actual attorney and the actual consequence of having taken what wasn't his, had retreated with the speed of a man discovering that his advantage depended entirely on the other party not having access to legal representation. Anne had sent Eleanor a short letter that said simply, "I have my house back. Thank you for the door." Eleanor read it twice and put it in the box where she kept the most important things. Clara Bennett had called twice since the hearing, once to tell Eleanor she had 2 new commissions that had come specifically because word had gotten around that she had told the truth when it mattered, and once just to sit and have tea, which was Clara's way of saying that she was trying to do better with the space between obligation and courage. Eleanor had been glad to see her both times. Margaret had left for Philadelphia the previous week. Eleanor had received a single letter brief and not elaborated that said, "The school was the right thing to do with that house. Your mother would have been glad of it. I hope you find what you are looking for." No signature. Just the handwriting that Eleanor had known for 12 years and would know forever, compressed into 3 sentences that were, she thought, approximately as honest as Margaret had ever been with her. She did not write back immediately. She was thinking about what she wanted to say. She had time. It was Nathaniel who found the silver clasp. He didn't mean to. He had come into Eleanor's room looking for a book he'd lent her 2 weeks ago, and she wasn't there, and the clasp was sitting in its small box on the bedside table, which was where it had been since the wedding night. He picked it up without thinking. It was a reflex, the habit of a man who picks things up and examines them, and he was standing there with it in his hand when Eleanor came in from the dressing room. She stopped when she saw him holding it. "Sorry," he said immediately. "I was looking for— I didn't mean to." "It's all right," she said. She came across the room, and he held it out to her, and she took it and stood with it in her palm. Small, iron-colored against her skin, the evidence of a specific morning. "Why do you keep it?" he asked. She had been waiting for this question, not consciously, but in the way you wait for a question you know is coming. You're not aware of the waiting until the question arrives and you realize you had the answer already. "Because I want to remember what I'm made of," she said. "Not the pain of it. Not what she did. What I did." She turned the clasp over in her fingers. "I walked down that aisle, Nathaniel, with this thing cutting into me in front of 200 people, and I breathed and I held on, and I said what I meant to say, and I did not fall." She paused. "I've spent a long time being told that I was fragile. By Margaret, by the world in general, by every arrangement that was made around me instead of with me." She closed her fingers around the clasp. "I keep this because it reminds me that I am not fragile. I am someone who can carry a very great deal and still arrive. Nathaniel was very still watching her. "And," she said, "I want to remember the day I stopped arriving silently." He reached out and put his hand over her closed fist, not taking the clasp, not opening her hand, just his hand over hers, the way he'd done in the magistrate's hall, quiet and solid, and there. "You are not fragile," he said. "You are the least fragile person I know, and I know several people who have been through considerable things." She looked up at him. "That might be the most direct compliment you've ever paid me." "I'm working on directness," he said. "You're a good example to follow." She turned her hand over inside his and held it, and they stood like that in the room that was hers, and his and theirs together, with the summer turning to something cooler outside, and the Virginia light doing its slow afternoon work through the windows, and Eleanor thought about everything that word home was learning to contain. Data. The school opened in October. It was not called the Whitmore Academy because Eleanor had specifically asked that it not be because she was not interested in monuments to her own name or her family's. It was called the Virginia County School for Girls, which was plain and accurate, and said what it was, and it opened with 14 students and Mrs. Doyle at its head, and 3 additional teachers that Eleanor had helped recruit over the previous 6 weeks. Eleanor attended the opening and said very little because it was not her day to speak. It was the day for Mrs. Doyle to speak, and for the 14 girls to sit in the rooms that had once been someone's parlors and dining rooms and private spaces, and to open books in them, and for the county to see that this was now what that house was for. She stood at the back of what had been her stepmother's sitting room, the room with the mahogany bureau, the room where she had retrieved the letters with a key on a ribbon, and she watched a girl of perhaps 12 read aloud from a text with the particular fierce concentration of someone who has recently learned to love doing something, and she felt something that was too large to name and that she did not try to name. Nathaniel was beside her. He had come quietly without announcement, had stood at the back of the room with her. She was not surprised he was there. "She reads well," he said quietly. "She's going to be remarkable," Eleanor said. She didn't know why she was certain of this. She was certain of it anyway. "How do you know?" "Because someone told her she could," Eleanor said. "That's often enough." He looked at her sideways, and she felt the look the way she felt most things from him now. Directly without the layer of managed distance she'd kept between herself and the world for so long. "Someone told you," he said. "My father did," she said. "In 17 letters. And then eventually, a very difficult man in a hallway asked me a simple question and managed to tell me without saying a word." He was quiet. "You're going to have to learn to take a compliment," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. "I told you, directness takes practice." She took his arm not formally, not for the room, just took it. And she looked at the girl, reading, and at Mrs. Doyle watching her read, and at the room that was no longer a room, where decisions about her life had been made without her. And she breathed all the way to the bottom, the way she'd been breathing since the morning after the wedding, full and complete and entirely her own. That evening, back at Ashford Estate, she sat at the writing desk, and she opened the small box, and she took out the silver clasp. She held it for a moment. Then she crossed the room to the shelf where her mother's sewing box sat, and she opened it, and she placed the clasp inside, not hidden, not displayed, just there alongside the threads and the needles and the folded square of her mother's quilt. Kept but not carried, present but not a weight. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway. He watched her close the sewing box and set it back on the shelf, and he waited until she turned before he spoke. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He came into the room, and he stood in the way he stood when he was about to say something he had thought about carefully, and she turned to face him and gave him the space to say it. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I want to say it plainly, because I've been practicing plainness, and this seems like the right application." "All right," she said. "I love you," he said. Directly, without preamble, without the careful architecture of approach. Just the words and the voice he used for true things. "I don't know when exactly it happened. I know it was before the hearing. I think it might have been the morning you came to find me in the barn and told me your plan and asked what I thought, not for permission, but for my actual opinion." He paused. "That was when I knew I was not in the territory I'd planned for." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the girl in the hallway who had said, "I believe you mean it," and had been learning ever since what it cost to believe things and what it was worth. She thought about 17 letters and a key on a ribbon and a room full of women who had waited for a door. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere you hadn't planned to go and find that it was exactly right. "I love you too," she said. "I've been trying to figure out when to say it, and I think the answer is now." He reached for her hand. Not the formal gesture, not the public one, just reached, and she gave it to him. And they stood in the study that was theirs, and the house that was theirs, and the life that was theirs. Two people who had found each other through the mechanism of one good man's foresight, and their own hard work, and a great deal of difficult truth, and Eleanor thought, this is what my father saw when he looked forward. This exact thing. This room, and this man, and this version of me. He had seen it, and he had written it down 17 times to make sure she could find her way to it. She had found her way to it. Outside, the Virginia evening was coming down cool and clear. The first real hint of autumn, and the summer, the long, impossible summer, that had started with a dress that cut into her, and a room that smelled like flowers, and a walk down an aisle that she had survived on nothing but will, was finally gracefully letting go. Eleanor Ashford was not the woman who had walked into that church on a June morning in 1817, silent and managed and bleeding beneath the white silk. She was not fragile. She was not someone else's arrangement. She was not the sum of what had been decided about her without her presence. She was the woman who had read 17 letters by lamplight, and wept and gotten up and done the work. The woman who had opened a locked drawer with a key she'd kept for 8 years against exactly this moment. The woman who had stood in front of a room full of Richmond and said the true thing in her own voice, with no one's permission but her own. She was Eleanor Ashford, and she knew what she was made of, and she was not afraid. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything.